This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe, Section 20. I was now returned to London, and though by the accident of the last adventure I got something considerable, yet I was not fond of any more country rambles, nor should I have ventured abroad again if I had carried the trade on to the end of my days. I gave my governess a history of my travels. She liked the Harwich journey well enough, and in discoursing of these things between ourselves, she observed that a thief being a creature that watches the advantages of other people's mistakes, it is impossible but that to one that is vigilant and industrious many opportunities must happen, and therefore she thought that one so exquisitely keen in the trade as I was would scarce fail of something extraordinary wherever I went. On the other hand, every branch of my story, if duly considered, may be useful to honest people, and afford a due caution to people of some sort or other to guard against the like surprises, and to have their eyes about them when they have to do with strangers of any kind, for it is very seldom that some snare or other is not in their way. The moral, indeed, of all my history is left to be gathered by the senses and judgment of the reader. I am not qualified to preach to them. Let the experience of one creature completely wicked and completely miserable be a storehouse or useful warning to those that read. I am drawing now towards a new variety of the scenes of life. Upon my return, being hardened by a long race of crime, and success unparalleled, at least in the reach of my own knowledge, I had, as I have said, no thoughts of laying down a trade which, if I was to judge by the example of others, must, however, end at last in misery and sorrow. It was on the Christmas day following, in the evening, that, to finish a long train of wickedness, I went abroad to see what might offer my way. When going by a working silversmith's in Foster Lane, I saw a tempting bait indeed, and not be resisted by one of my occupation, for the shop had nobody in it, as I could see, and a great deal of loose plate lay in the window, and at the seat of the man, who usually, as I supposed, worked at one side of the shop. I went boldly in, and was just going to lay my hand on a piece of plate, and might have done it, and carried it clear off, for any care that the men who belonged to the shop had taken of it, but an officious fellow in a house, not a shop, on the other side of the way, seeing me go in, and observing that there was nobody in the shop, comes running over the street and into the shop, and without asking me what I was or who, seizes upon me, and cries out for the people of the house. I had not, as I said above, touched anything in the shop, and seeing a glimpse of somebody running over to the shop, I had so much presence of mind as to knock very hard with my foot on the floor of the house, and was just calling out too, when the fellow laid his hands on me. However, as I always had most courage when I was in most danger, so, when the fellow laid hands on me, I stood very high upon it, that I came in to buy 6 of silver spoons, and to my good fortune it was a silversmith that sold plate, as well as worked plate for other shops. The fellow laughed at that part, and put such a value upon the service that he had done his neighbour, that he would have it be that I came not to buy but to steal, and raising a great crowd, I said to the master of the shop, who by this time was fetched home from some neighbouring place, that it was in vain to make noise, and to enter into talk there of the case. The fellow had insisted that I came to steal, and he must prove it, and I desired we might go before a magistrate without any more words, for I began to see I should be too hard for the man that had seized me. The master and mistress of the shop were really not so violent as the man from the other side of the way, and the man said, "Mistress, you might come into the shop with a good design for aught I know, but it seemed a dangerous thing for you to come into such a shop as mine is when you see nobody there, and I cannot do justice to my neighbour, who was so kind to me as not to acknowledge he had reason on his side, though upon the whole I do not find you attempted to take anything, and I really know not what to do in it." I pressed him to go before a magistrate with me, and if anything could be proved on me that was like a design of robbery, I should willingly submit, but if not, I expected reparation. Just while we were in this debate, and a crowd of people gathered about the door, came by Sir T.B., an alderman of the city, and justice of the peace, and the goldsmith, hearing of it, goes out, and entreated his worship to come in and decide the case. Give the goldsmith his due, he told his story with a great deal of justice and moderation, and the fellow that had come over and seized upon me told his with as much heat and foolish passion, which did me good still rather than harm. It came then my turn to speak, and I told his worship that I was a stranger in London, being newly come out of the north, that I was lodged in such a place, that I was passing this street, and went into the goldsmith's shop to buy half a dozen of spoons. By great luck I had an old silver spoon in my pocket, which I pulled out, and told him I had carried that spoon to match it with half a dozen of new ones, that it might match some I had in the country. That seeing nobody in the shop, I knocked with my foot very hard to make the people hear, and had also called aloud with my voice. 'Tis true there was loose plate in the shop, but that nobody could say I had touched any of it, or gone near it, that a fellow came running into the shop out of the street, and laid hands on me in a furious manner, in the very moments while I was calling for the people of the house, that if he had really had a mind to have done his neighbour any service, he should have stood at a distance, and silently watched to see whether I touched anything or no, and then have clapped in upon me, and taken me in the fact. That is very true, said Mr. Alderman, and turning to the fellow that stopped me, he asked him if it was true that I knocked with my foot. He said, yes, I had knocked, but that might be because of his coming. Nay, said the alderman, taking him short, now you contradict yourself, for just now you said she was in the shop with her back to you, and did not see you till you came upon her. Now, it was true that my back was partly to the street, but yet, as my business was of a kind that required me to have my eyes every way, so I really had a glance of him running over, as I said before, though he did not perceive it. After a full hearing, the alderman gave it as his opinion that his neighbour was under a mistake, and that I was innocent, and the goldsmith acquiesced in it too, and his wife, and so I was dismissed. But as I was going to depart, Mr. Alderman said, But hold, madam, if you were designing to buy spoons, I hope you will not let my friend here lose his customer by the mistake. I readily answered, No, sir, I'll buy the spoon still, if he can match my odd spoon, which I brought for a pattern. And the goldsmith showed me some of the very same fashion. So he weighed the spoons, and they came to 35 shillings, so I pulls out my purse to pay him, in which I had near 20 guineas, for I never went without such a sum about me, whatever might happen, and I found it of use at other times as well as now. When Mr. Alderman saw my money, he said, Well, madam, now I am satisfied you were wronged, and it was for this reason that I moved you should buy the spoons, and stayed till you had bought them. For if you had not had money to pay for them, I should have suspected that you did not come into the shop with an interest to buy. For indeed, the sort of people who come upon these designs that you have been charged with are seldom troubled with much gold in their pockets, as I see you are. I smiled, and told his worship that I owed something of his favour to my money, but I hoped he saw reason also in the justice he had done me before. He said yes, he had. But this having confirmed his opinion, he was fully satisfied now of my having been injured. So I came off with flying colours, though from an affair in which I was at the very brink of destruction. It was but 3 days after this, that not at all made cautious by my former danger as I used to be, and still pursuing the art which I had so long been employed in, I ventured into a house where I saw the doors open, and furnished myself, as I thought verily without being perceived, with 2 pieces of flowered silks, such as they call brocaded silks, very rich. It was not a mercer's shop, nor the warehouse of a mercer, but looked like a private dwelling-house, and was, it seems, inhabited by a man that sold goods for the weavers to the mercers, like a broker or a factor. That I may make short of this black part of the story, I was attacked by 2 wenches, that came open-mouthed at me just as I was going out the door, and one of them pulled me back into the room, while the other shut the door upon me. I would have given them good words, but there was no room for it. 2 fiery dragons could not have been more furious than they were. They tore my clothes, bullied and roared as if they would have murdered me. The mistress of the house came next, and then the master, and all outrageous for a while especially. I gave the master very good words, told him the door was open, and things were a temptation to me, that I was poor and distressed, and poverty was when many could not resist, and begged him with tears to have pity on me. The mistress of the house was moved with compassion, and inclined to have let me go, and had almost persuaded her husband to it also. But the saucy wenches were run even before they were sent, and had fetched a constable. And then the master said he could not go back. I must go before a justice, and answered his wife that he might come into trouble himself if he should let me go. The sight of the constable indeed struck me with terror, and I thought I should have sunk into the ground. I fell into faintings, and indeed the people themselves thought I would have died, when the woman argued again for me, and entreated her husband, seeing that they had lost nothing, to let me go. I offered to pay him for the 2 pieces, whatever the value was, though I had not got them, and argued that, as he had his goods, and had lost really nothing, it would be cruel to pursue me to death, and have my blood for the bare attempt of taking them. I put the constable in mind that I had broke no doors, nor carried anything away, and when I came to the justice, and pleaded that I had neither broken anything to get in, nor carried anything out, the justice was inclined to have released me. But the first saucy jade that stopped me, affirming that I was going out with the goods, but that she stopped me and pulled me back as I was upon the threshold, the justice upon that point committed me, and I was carried to Newgate. That horrid place! My very blood chills at the mere mention of its name, the place where so many of my comrades had been locked up, and from whence they went to the fatal tree, the place where my mother suffered so deeply, where I was brought into the world, and from whence I expected no redemption but by an infamous death. To conclude, the place that had so long expected me, and which with so much art and success I had so long avoided. I was not fixed indeed. 'Tis impossible to describe the terror of my mind when I was first brought in, and when I looked around upon all the horrors of that dismal place. I looked on myself as lost, and that I had nothing to think of but going out of the world, and that with the utmost infamy. The hellish noise, the roaring, swearing, and clamour, the stench and nastiness, and all the dreadful crowd of afflicting things that I saw there, joined together to make the place seem an emblem of hell itself, and a kind of entrance into it. Now I reproached myself with the many hints I had had, as I have mentioned above, from my own reason, from the sense of my good circumstances, and of the many dangers I had escaped, to leave off while I was well, and how I had withstood them all, and hardened my thoughts against all fear. It seemed to me that I was hurried on by an inevitable and unseen fate to this day of my misery, and that now I was to expiate all my offences at the gallows, that I was now to give satisfaction to justice with my blood, and that I was come to the last hour of my life and of my wickedness together. These things poured themselves in upon my thoughts in a confused manner, and left me overwhelmed with melancholy and despair. Them I repented heartily of all my life past, but that repentance yielded me no satisfaction, no peace, no, not in the least, because, as I said to myself, it was repenting after the power of further sinning was taken away. I seemed not to mourn that I had committed such crimes, and for the fact as it was an offence against God and my neighbour, but I mourned that I was to be punished for it. I was a penitent, as I thought, not that I had sinned, but that I was to suffer, and this took away all the comfort, and even the hope of my repentance in my own thoughts. I got no sleep for several nights or days after I came into that wretched place, and glad I would have been for some time to have died there, though I did not consider dying as it ought to be considered neither. Indeed, nothing could be filled with more horror to my imagination than the very place, nothing was more odious to me than the company that was there. Oh, if I had been sent away to any place in the world, and not to Newgate, I should have thought myself happy. In the next place, how did the hardened wretches that were there before me triumph over me? What, Mrs. Flanders come to Newgate at last? What, Mrs. Mary, Mrs. Molly, and after that plain Moll Flanders? They thought the devil had helped me, they said, that I had reigned so long. They expected me there many years ago, and was I come at last? Then they flouted me with my dejections, welcomed me to the place, wished me joy, bid me have a good heart, not to be cast down, things might not be so bad as I feared, and the like, then called for brandy and drank to me, but put it all up to my score, for they told me I was but just come to the college, as they called it, and sure I had money in my pocket, though they had none. I asked one of this crew how long she had been there. She said 4 months. I asked her how the place looked to her when she first came into it. "Just as it did now to you," says she. dreadful and frightful, that she thought she was in hell, and I believe so still, adds she, but it is natural to me, so I don't disturb myself about it. I suppose, says I, you are in no danger of what's to follow. Nay, said she, for you are mistaken there, I assure you. I am under sentence, only I pleaded my belly, but I am no more with child than the judge that tried me, and I expect to be called down next sessions. This calling down is calling to their former judgment, when a woman has been respited for her belly, but proves not to be with child, or if she has been with child, and been brought to bed. Well, says I, are you thus easy? Ay, said she, I can't help myself. What signifies being sad? If I'm hanged, there's an end of me, says she, and away she turns dancing, and sings as she goes the following piece of Newgate wit. If I swing by the string, I shall hear the bell ring, and then there's an end of poor Jenny. I mention this because it would here be worth the observation of any prisoner who shall hereafter fall into the same misfortune, and come to that dreadful place of Newgate, how time, necessity, and conversing with the wretches that are there, familiarizes the place to them; how at last they become reconciled to that which at first was the greatest dread upon their spirits in the world, and are as impudently cheerful and merry in their misery as they were when out of it. I cannot say, as some do, this devil is not so black as he is painted, for indeed no colours can represent the place to the life, not any soul conceive a right of it but those who have been sufferers there. But how hell should become by degrees so natural, and not only tolerable but even agreeable, is a thing unintelligible but by those who have experienced it as I have. The same night that I was sent to Newgate, I sent the news of it to my old governess, who was surprised at it, you may be sure, and spent the night almost as ill out of Newgate as I did in it. The next morning she came to see me. She did what she could to comfort me, but she saw it was to no purpose. However, as she said, to sink under the weight was but to increase the weight. She immediately applied herself to all the proper methods to prevent the effects of it, which we feared, and first she found out the 2 fiery jades that had surprised me. She tampered with them, offered them money, and, in a word, tried all imaginable ways to prevent a prosecution. She offered one of the wenches £100 to go away from her mistress, and not to appear against me, but she was so resolute that though she was but a servant maid at £3 a year wages, or thereabouts, she refused it, and would have refused it, as my governess said she believed, if she had offered her 500. Then she attacked the other maid. She was not so hard-hearted in appearance as the other, and sometimes seemed inclined to be merciful, but the first wench kept her up, and changed her mind, and would not so much as let my governess talk with her, but threatened to have her up for tampering with the evidence. Then she applied to the master, that is to say, the man whose goods had been stolen, and particularly to his wife, who, as I told you, was inclined at first to have some compassion for me. She found the woman the same still, but the man alleged he was bound by the justice that committed me to prosecute, and that he should forfeit his recognizance. My governess offered to find friends that should get his recognizances off of the file, as they called it, and that he should not suffer, but it was not possible to convince him that it could be done, or that he could be safe any way in the world but by appearing against me. So I was to have 3 witnesses of fact against me, the master and his 2 maids, that is to say, I was as certain to be cast for my life as I was certain that I was alive, and I had nothing to do but think of dying, and prepare for it. I had but a sad foundation to build upon, as I said before, for all my repentance appeared to me to be only the effect of my fear of death, not a sincere regret for the wicked life that I had lived, and which had brought this misery upon me, for the offending my Creator, who was suddenly to be my judge. I lived many days here in the utmost horror of my soul. I had death, as it were, in view, and thought of nothing night and day, but of gibbets and halters, evil spirits and devils. It is not to be expressed by words how I was harassed, between the dreadful apprehensions of death, and the terror of my conscience reproaching me with my horrible past life. The ordinary of Newgate came to me, and talked a little in his way, but all his divinity ran upon confessing my crime, as he called it, though he knew not what I was in for, making a full discovery, and the like, without which, he told me, God would never forgive me, and he said so little to the purpose, that I had no manner of consolation from him, and then to observe the poor creature preaching confession and repentance to me in the morning, and find him drunk with brandy and spirits by noon, this had something in it so shocking, that I began to nauseate the man more than his work, and his work too by degrees, for the sake of the man, so that I desired him to trouble me no more. I know not how it was, but by the indefatigable application of my diligent governess, I had no bill preferred against me at the first sessions, I mean to the grand jury, at Guildhall, so I had another month or 5 weeks before me, and without doubt this ought to have been accepted by me, as so much time given me for reflection upon what was past, and preparation for what was to come. Or, in a word, I ought to have esteemed it as a space given me for repentance, and have employed it as such, but it was not in me. I was sorry, as before, for being in Newgate, but had very few signs of repentance about me. On the contrary, like the waters in the cavities and hollows of mountains, which petrify and turn into stone whatever they are suffered to drop on, so the continual conversing with such a crew of hell-hounds as I was had the same common operation upon me as upon other people. I degenerated into stone. I turned first stupid and senseless, then brutish and thoughtless, and at last raving mad as any of them were, and in short I became as naturally pleased and easy with the place as if indeed I had been born there. It is scarce possible to imagine that our natures should be capable of so much degeneracy as to make that pleasant and agreeable that in itself is the most complete misery. Here was a circumstance that I think it scarce possible to mention a worse. I was as exquisitely miserable as, speaking of common cases, it was possible for any one to be that had life and health and money to help them, as I had. I had weight of guilt upon me, enough to sink any creature who had the least power of reflection left, and had any sense upon them of the happiness of this life, of the misery of another. Then I had at first remorse indeed, but no repentance. I had now neither remorse nor repentance. I had a crime charged on me, the punishment of which was death by our law, the proof so evident that there was no room for me so much as to plead not guilty. I had the name of an old offender, so that I had nothing to expect but death in a few weeks' time, neither had I myself any thoughts of escaping, and yet a certain strange lethargy of soul possessed me. I had no trouble, no apprehensions, no sorrow about me. The first surprise was gone. I was, I may well say, I know not how. My senses, my reason, nay, my conscience were all asleep. My course of life for 40 years had been a horrid complication of wickedness, whoredom, adultery, incest, lying, and theft, and in a word, everything but murder and treason had been my practice from the age of 18, or thereabouts, to 60, and now I was engulfed in the misery of punishment, and had an infamous death just at the door. And yet I had no sense of my condition, no thought of heaven or hell at least, that went any further than a bare flying touch, like the stitch or pain that gives a hint and goes off. I had neither a heart to ask God's mercy, nor indeed to think of it, and in this, I think, I have given a brief description of the completest misery on earth. All my terrifying thoughts were past. The horror of the place were become familiar, and I felt no more uneasiness at the noise and clamours of the prison than they did who made that noise. In a word, I was become a mere Newgate bird, as wicked and as outrageous as any of them. Nay, I scarce retained the habit and custom of good breeding and manners, which all along till now ran through my conversation. So thorough a degeneracy had possessed me, that I was no more the same thing that I had been, than if I had never been otherwise than what I was now. In the middle of this hardened part of my life, I had another sudden surprise, which called me back a little to that thing called sorrow, which indeed I began to be past the sense of before. They told me one night that there was brought into the prison late the night before 3 highwaymen, who had committed robbery somewhere on the road to Windsor, Hounslow Heath I think it was, and were pursued to Uxbridge by the country, and were taken there after a gallant resistance, in which I know not how many of the country people were wounded, and some killed. It is not to be wondered that we prisoners were all desirous enough to see these brave topping gentlemen, that were talked up to be such as their fellows had not been known, and especially because it was said that they would in the morning be removed to the press yard, having given money to the headmaster of the prison, to be allowed the liberty of that better part of the prison. So we that were women placed ourselves in the way, that we would be sure to see them. But nothing could express the amazement and surprise I was in, when the very first man that came out I knew to be my Lancashire husband, the same who lived so well at Dunstable, and the same who I afterwards saw at Brickhill, when I was married to my last husband, as has been related. I was struck dumb at the sight, and knew neither what to say nor what to do. He did not know me, and that was all the present relief I had. I quitted my company, and retired as much as that dreadful place suffers anybody to retire, and cried vehemently for a great while. "Dreadful creature that I am," said I, "how many poor people have I made miserable? How many desperate wretches have I sent to the devil?" He had told me at Chester he was ruined by that match, and his fortunes were made desperate on my account. For that thinking I had been a fortune, he was run into debt more than he was able to pay, and that he knew not what course to take, that he would go into the army and carry a musket, or buy a horse and take a tour, as he called it. And though I never told him that I was a fortune, and so did not actually deceive him myself, yet I did encourage the having it thought that I was so, and by that means I was the occasion originally of his mischief. The surprise of the thing only struck deeper into my thoughts, and gave me stronger reflections than all that had befallen me before. I grieved day and night for him, and the more for that they told me he was the captain of the gang, and that he had committed so many robberies that Hind or Whitney or the Golden Farmer were fools to him, that he would surely be hanged if there were no more men left in the country he was born in, and that there would be abundance of people come in against him. I was overwhelmed with grief for him. My own case gave me no disturbance compared to this, and I loaded myself with reproaches on his account. I bewailed his misfortunes, and the ruin he was now come to at such a rate that I relished nothing now as I did before, and the first reflections I made upon the horrible, detestable life I had lived began to return upon me, and as these things returned, my abhorrence of the place I was in, and of the way of living in it, returned also. In a word, I was perfectly changed, and became another body. While I was under these influences of sorrow for him, came notice to me that the next sessions approaching there would be a bill preferred to the grand jury against me, and that I would certainly be tried for my life at the Old Bailey. My temper was touched before, the hardened, wretched boldness of spirit which I had acquired abated, and conscious in the prison, guilt began to flow in upon my mind. In short, I began to think, and to think is one real advance from hell into heaven. All that hellish, hardened state and temper of soul, which I have said so much of before, is but a deprivation of thought. He that is restored to his power of thinking is restored to himself. As soon as I began, I say, to think, the first think that occurred to me broke out thus: "Lord, what will become of me? I shall certainly die. I shall be cast, to be sure, and there is nothing beyond that but death. I have no friends. What shall I do? I shall certainly be cast. Lord, have mercy upon me. What will become of me?" This was a sad thought, you will say, to be the first, after so long a time, that had started into my soul of that kind, and yet even this was nothing but fright at what was to come. There was not a word of sincere repentance in it at all. However, I was indeed dreadfully dejected, and disconsolate to the last degree, and as I had no friend in the world to communicate my distressed thoughts to, it lay so heavy upon me that it threw me into fits and swoonings several times a day. I sent for my old governess, and she, give her her due, acted the part of a true friend. She left no stone unturned to prevent the grand jury finding the bill. She sought out one or two of the jurymen, talked with them, and endeavoured to possess them with favourable dispositions, on account that nothing was taken, and no house broken, etc. But all would not do. They were overruled by the rest. The two wenches swore home to the fact, and the jury found the bill against me for robbery and housebreaking, that is, for felony and burglary. I sunk down when they brought me news of it, and after I came to myself again I thought I should have died with the weight of it. My governess acted a true mother to me. She pitied me, she cried with me, and for me, but she could not help me. And to add to the terror of it, 'twas the discourse all over the house that I should die for it. I could hear them talk it among themselves very often, and see them shake their heads and say they were sorry for it and the like, as is usual in the place, but still Nobody came to tell me their thoughts, till at last one of the keepers came to me privately, and said with a sigh, "Well, Mrs. Flanders, you will be tried on Friday." This was but a Wednesday. "What do you intend to do?" I turned as white as a clout, and said, "God knows what I shall do. For my part, I know not what to do." "Why," says he, "I won't flatter you. I would have you prepare for death, for I doubt you will be cast; and as they say you are an old offender, I doubt you will find but little mercy. They say," added he, "your case is very plain, and that the witnesses swear so home against you there will be no standing it." This was a stab into the very vitals of one under such a burthen as I was oppressed with before, and I could not speak to him a word, good or bad, for a great while, but at last I burst out into tears and said to him, "Lord, mister, what must I do?" "Do?" says he. "Send for the ordinary. Send for a minister and talk with him, for indeed, Mrs. Flanders, unless you have very good friends, you are no woman for this world." This was plain dealing indeed, but it was very harsh to me, at least I thought it so. He left me in the greatest confusion imaginable, and all that night I lay awake. And now I began to say my prayers, which I had scarce done before since my last husband's death, or from a little while after. And truly I may well call it saying my prayers, for I was in such a confusion, and had such horror upon my mind, that though I cried, and have repeated several times the ordinary expression of "Lord, have mercy on me," I never brought myself to any sense of my being a miserable sinner, as indeed I was, and of confessing my sins to God, and begging pardon for the sake of Jesus Christ. I was overwhelmed with the sense of my condition, being tried for my life, and sure to be condemned, and then I was as sure to be executed, and on this account I cried all night, "Lord, what will become of me? Lord, what shall I do? Lord, I shall be hanged. Lord, have mercy on me," and the like. My poor afflicted governess was now as much concerned as I, and a great deal more truly penitent, though she had no prospect of being brought to trial and sentence. Not but that she deserved it as much as I, and so she said herself, but she had not done anything herself for many years, other than receiving what I and others stole, and encouraging us to steal it. But she cried, and took on like a distracted body, wringing her hands, and crying out that she was undone, that she believed there was a curse from heaven upon her, that she should be damned, that she had been the destruction of all her friends, that she had brought such a one, and such a one, and such a one to the gallows. And there she reckoned up 10 or 11 people, some of which I have given account of, that came to untimely ends, and that now she was the occasion of my ruin, for she had persuaded me to go on, when I would have left off. I interrupted her there. "No, mother, no," said I, "don't speak of that, for you would have had me left off when I got the mercer's money again, and when I came home from Harwich, and would not hearken to you. Therefore you have not been to blame. It is I only have ruined myself. I have brought myself to this misery." And thus we spent many hours together. Well, there was no remedy. The prosecution went on, and on the Thursday I was carried down to the sessions house, where I was arraigned, as they called it, and the next day I was appointed to be tried. At the arraignment I pleaded not guilty, and well I might, for I was indicted for felony and burglary, that is, for feloniously stealing 2 pieces of brocaded silk, value £46, the goods of Anthony Johnson's, and for breaking open his doors, whereas I knew very well they could not pretend to prove I had broken the doors, or so much as lifted up a latch. On the Friday I was brought to my trial. I had exhausted my spirits with crying for 2 or 3 days before, so that I slept better the Thursday night than I expected, and had more courage for my trial than indeed I thought possible for me to have. When the trial began, the indictment was read. I would have spoke, but they told me the witnesses must be heard first, and then I should have time to be heard. The witnesses were the 2 wenches, a couple of hard-mouthed jades indeed, for though the thing was truth in the main, yet they aggravated it to the utmost extremity, and swore I had the goods wholly in my possession, that I had hid them among my clothes, that I was going off with them, that I had 1 foot over the threshold when they discovered themselves, and then I put the other over, so that I was quite out of the house in the street with the goods before they took hold of me, and then they seized me, and brought me back again, and they took the goods upon me. The fact in general was all true, but I believe, and insisted upon it, that they stopped me before I had set my foot clear of the threshold of the house, but that did not argue much, for certain it was that I had taken the goods, and I was bringing them away, if I had not been taken.
But I pleaded that I had stole nothing, they had lost nothing, the door was open, and I went in, seeing the goods lie there, and with design to buy. If seeing nobody in the house I had taken any of them up in my hand, it could not be concluded that I intended to steal them, for that I never carried them farther than the door, to look on them with the better light. The court would not allow that by any means, and made a kind of jest of my intending to buy the goods, that being no shop for the selling of anything, and as to carrying them to the door to look upon them, the maids made their impudent mocks upon that, and spent their wit upon it very much, told the court I had looked on them sufficiently, and approved them very well, for I had packed them up under my clothes, and was going with them. In short, I was found guilty of the felony, but acquitted of the burglary, which was but small comfort to me, the first bringing me a sentence of death, and the last would have done no more. The next day I was carried down to receive the dreadful sentence, and when they came to ask me what I had to say why sentence should not pass, I stood mute awhile, but somebody that stood behind me prompted me aloud to speak to the judges, for that they could represent things favourably for me. This encouraged me to speak, and I told them I had nothing to say to stop the sentence, but that I had much to say to bespeak the mercy of the court, that I hoped they would allow something in such a case for the circumstances of it, that I had broken no doors, had carried nothing off, that nobody had lost anything, that the person whose goods they were was pleased to say he desired mercy might be shown, which indeed he very honestly did, that at the worst it was the first offence, and that I had never before been in any court of justice before. And in a word, I spoke with more courage than I thought I could have done, and in such a moving tone, and though with tears, yet not so many tears as to obstruct my speech, that I could see it moved others to tears that heard me. The judges sat grave and mute, gave me an easy hearing, and time to say all that I would, but saying neither yes nor no to it, pronounced the sentence of death upon me, a sentence that was to me like death itself, which after it was read confounded me. I had no more spirit left in me, I had no tongue to speak, nor eyes to look up either to God nor man. My poor governess was utterly disconsolate, and she that was my comforter before wanted comfort now herself, and sometimes mourning, sometimes raging, was as much out of herself as to all outward appearance as any mad woman in Bedlam. Nor was she only disconsolate as to me, but she was struck with horror at the sense of her own wicked life, and began to look back upon it with a taste quite different from mine, for she was penitent to the highest degree for her sins, as well as sorrowful for the misfortune. She sent for a minister too, a serious, pious, good man, and applied herself with such earnestness by his assistance to the work of a sincere repentance, that I believe, and so did the minister too, that she was a true penitent, and which is still more, she was not only so for the occasion, and at that juncture, but she continued so, as I was informed, to the day of her death. It is rather to be thought of than expressed what was now my condition. I had nothing before me but present death, and as I had no friends to assist me, or to stir for me, I expected nothing but to find my name in the dead warrant, which was to come down for the execution, the Friday afterwards, of 5 more and myself. End of section 20.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 21. In the meantime, my poor distressed governess sent me a minister, who, at her request first, and at my own afterwards, came to visit me. He exhorted me seriously to repent of all my sins, and to dally no longer with my soul, not flattering myself with hopes of life, which, he said, he was informed there was no room to expect, but unfeignedly to look up to God with my whole soul, and to cry for pardon in the name of Jesus Christ. He backed his discourses with proper quotations of Scripture, encouraging the greatest sinner to repent and turn from their evil way, and when he had done, he kneeled down and prayed with me. It was now that, for the first time, I felt any real signs of repentance. I now began to look back upon my past life with abhorrence, and having a kind of view into the other side of time and things of life, as I believe they do with everybody at such a time, began to look with a different aspect and quite another shape than they did before. The greatest and best things, the views of felicity, the joy, the griefs of life, were quite other things, and I had nothing in my thoughts but what was so infinitely superior to what I had known in life, that it appeared to me to be the greatest stupidity in nature to lay any weight upon anything, though the most valuable in this world. The word eternity represented itself with all its incomprehensible additions, and I had such extended notions of it that I know not how to express them. Among the rest, how vile, how gross, how absurd did every pleasant thing look. I mean that we had counted pleasant before, especially when I reflected that those sordid trifles were the things for which we forfeited eternal felicity. With these reflections came, of mere course, severe reproaches of my own mind for my wretched behavior in my past life, that I had forfeited all hope of any happiness in the eternity that I was just going to enter into, and on the contrary was entitled to all that was miserable or had been conceived of misery, and all this with the frightful addition of its being also eternal. I am not capable of reading lectures of instruction to anybody, but I relate this in the very manner in which things then appeared to me, as far as I am able, but infinitely short of the lively impressions which they made on my soul at that time. Indeed, those impressions are not to be explained in words, or if they are, I am not mistress of words enough to express them. It must be the work of every sober reader to make just reflections on them, as their own circumstances may direct, and without question this is what every one at some time or other may feel something of. I mean a clearer sight into things to come than they had here, and a dark view of their own concern in them. But I go back to my own case. The minister pressed me to tell him, as far as I thought convenient, in what state I found myself as to the sight I had of things beyond life. He told me he did not come as ordinary of the place, whose business it is to extort confessions from prisoners for private ends or for the further detecting of other offenders, that his business was to move me to such freedom of discourse as might serve to disburden my own mind, and furnish him to administer comfort to me as far as was in his power, and assured me that whatever I said to him should remain with him, and be as much a secret as if it was known only to God and myself, and that he desired to know nothing of me but as above, to qualify him to apply proper advice and assistance to me, and to pray to God for me. This honest, friendly way of treating me unlocked all the sluices of my passions. He broke into my very soul by it, and I unravelled all the wickedness of my life to him. In a word, I gave him an abridgment of this whole history. I gave him a picture of my conduct for 50 years in miniature. I hid nothing from him, and he in return exhorted me to sincere repentance, explained to me what he meant by repentance, and then drew out such a scheme of infinite mercy, proclaimed from heaven to sinners of the greatest magnitude, that he left me nothing to say that looked like despair or doubting of being accepted, and in this condition he left me the first night. He visited me again the next morning, and went on with his method of explaining the terms of divine mercy, which, according to him, consisted of nothing more or more difficult than that of being sincerely desirous of it and willing to accept it, only a sincere regret for and hatred of those things I had done, which rendered me so just an object of divine vengeance. I am not able to repeat the excellent discourses of this extraordinary man. 'Tis all that I am able to do to say that he revived my heart, and brought me into such a condition that I never knew anything of in my life before. I was covered with shame and tears for things past, and yet had at the same time a secret surprising joy at the prospect of being a true penitent, and obtaining the comfort of a penitent. I mean the hope of being forgiven. And so swift did thoughts circulate, and so high did the impressions they had made upon me run, that I thought I could freely have gone out that minute to execution without any uneasiness at all, casting my soul entirely into the arms of infinite mercy as a penitent. The good gentleman was so moved also in my behalf with a view of the influence which he saw these things had on me, that he blessed God he had come to visit me, and resolved not to leave me till the last moment, that is, not to leave visiting me. It was no less than 12 days after our receiving sentence before any were ordered for execution, and then upon a Wednesday the dead warrant, as they call it, came down, and I found my name was among them. A terrible blow this was to my new resolutions. Indeed, my heart sank within me, and I swooned away twice, one after another, but spoke not a word. The good minister was sorely afflicted for me, and did what he could to comfort me with the same arguments and the same moving eloquence that he did before, and left me not that evening so long as the prison keepers would suffer him to stay in the prison, unless he would be locked up with me all night, which he was not willing to be. I wondered much that I did not see him all the next day, it being the day before the time appointed for execution, and I was greatly discouraged and dejected in my mind, and indeed almost sank for want of the comfort which he had so often and with such success yielded me on his former visits. I waited with great impatience and under the greatest oppressions of spirits imaginable till about 4 o'clock, when he came to my apartment, for I had obtained the favor by the help of money, nothing being done in that place without it, not to be kept in the condemned hole, as they call it, among the rest of the prisoners who were to die, but to have a little dirty chamber to myself. My heart leapt within me for joy when I heard his voice at the door, even before I saw him. But let anyone judge what kind of motion I found in my soul, when after having made a short excuse for his not coming, he showed me that his time had been employed on my account, that he had obtained a favorable report from the recorder to the Secretary of State in my particular case, and, in short, that he had brought me a reprieve. He used all the caution that he was able in letting me know a thing which it would have been a double cruelty to have concealed, and yet it was too much for me. For as grief had overset me before, so did joy overset me now, and I fell into a much more dangerous swooning than I did at first, and it was not without a great difficulty that I was recovered at all, the good man having made a very Christian exhortation to me, not to let the joy of my reprieve but the remembrance of my past sorrow out of my mind, and having told me that he must leave, to go and enter the reprieve in the books, the most advantageous to myself and the most instructive to others. Such, however, will, I hope, allow me the liberty to make my story complete. It would be a severe satire on such to say they do not relish the repentance as much as I do the crime, and that they had rather the history were a complete tragedy, as it was very likely to have been. But I go on with my relation. The next morning there was a sad scene indeed in the prison. The first thing I was saluted with in the morning was the tolling of the great bell at St. Sepulchre's, as they call it, which ushered in the day. As soon as it began to toll, a dismal groaning and crying was heard from the condemned hole, where there lay 6 poor souls who were to be executed that day, some from one crime, some for another, and 2 of them for murder. This was followed by a confused clamor in the house, among the several sorts of prisoners expressing their awkward sorrows for the poor creatures that were to die, but in a manner extremely differing one from another. Some cried for them, some huzzaed, and wished them a good journey. Some damned and cursed those that had brought them to it, that is, meaning the evidence or prosecutors, many pitying them, and some few, but very few, praying for them. There was hardly room for so much composure of mind as was required for me to bless the merciful Providence that had, as it were, snatched me out of the jaws of this destruction. I remained, as it were, dumb and silent, overcome with the sense of it, and not able to express what I had in my heart. For the passions on such occasions as these are certainly so agitated as not to be able presently to regulate their own motions. All the while the poor condemned creatures were preparing to their death, and the ordinary, as they call him, was busy with them, disposing them to submit to their sentence. I say all this while I was seized with a fit of trembling, as much as I could have been if I had been in the same condition as to be sure the day before I expected to be. I was so violently agitated by this surprising fit that I shook as if I had been in the cold fit of an ague, so that I could not speak or look, but like one distracted. As soon as they were all put into carts and gone, which, however, I had not courage enough to see, I say as soon as they were gone, I fell into a fit of crying, involuntarily and without design, but as a mere distemper, and yet so violent, and it held me so long, that I knew not what course to take, nor could I stop or put a check to it, no, not with all the strength and courage I had. This fit of crying held me near 2 hours, and, as I believe, held me till they were all out of the world, and then a most humble, penitent, serious kind of joy succeeded. A real transport it was, or passion of joy and thankfulness, but still unable to give me vent to it by words, and in this I continued most part of the day. In the evening the good minister visited me again, and then fell to his usual good discourses. He congratulated my having a space yet allowed me for repentance, whereas the state of those 6 poor creatures was determined, and they were now past the offers of salvation. He earnestly pressed me to retain the same sentiments of the things of life that I had when I had a view of eternity, and at the end of all told me I should not conclude that all was over, that a reprieve was not a pardon, that he could not yet answer for the effects of it. However, I had this mercy, that I had more time given me, and that it was my business to improve that time. This discourse, though very sensible, left a kind of sadness on my heart, as if I might expect the affair would have a tragical issue still, which, however, he had no certainty of, and I did not indeed at that time question him about it, he having said that he would do his utmost to bring it to a good end, and that he hoped he might, but he would not have me be secure, and the consequence proved that he had reason for what he said. It was about a fortnight after this that I had some just apprehensions that I should be included in the next dead warrant at the ensuing sessions, and that it was not without great difficulty, and at last a humble petition for transportation, that I avoided it. So ill was I beholding to fame, and so prevailing was the fatal report of being an old offender, though in that they did not do me strict justice, for I was not in the sense of the law an old offender, whatever I was in the eye of the judge, for I had never been before them in a judicial way before, so the judges could not charge me with being an old offender, but the recorder was pleased to represent my case as he thought fit. I had now a certainty of life indeed, but with the hard conditions of being ordered for transportation, which indeed was hard condition in itself, but not when comparatively considered, and therefore I shall make no comments upon the sentence, nor upon the choice I was put to. We shall all choose anything rather than death, especially when 'tis attended by an uncomfortable prospect beyond it, which was my case. The good minister, whose interest, though a stranger to me, had obtained me the reprieve, mourned sincerely for this part. He was in hopes, he said, that I should have ended my days under the influence of good instruction, that I should not have been turned loose again among the wretched crew, as they generally are, who are thus sent abroad, where, as he said, I must have more than ordinary secret assistance from the grace of God, if I did not turn as wicked again as ever. I have not for a good while mentioned my governess, who had during most, if not all, of this part, been dangerously sick, and being in as near a view of death by her disease as I was by my sentence, was a great penitent. I say, I have not mentioned her, nor indeed did I see her in all this time, but being now recovering, and just able to come abroad, she came to see me. I told her my condition, and what different flux and reflux of tears and hopes I had been agitated with. I told her what I had escaped, and upon what terms, and she was present when the minister expressed his fears of my relapsing into wickedness, upon my falling into the wretched companies that are generally transported. Indeed, I had a melancholy reflection upon it in my own mind, for I knew what a dreadful gang was always sent away together, and I said to my governess that a good minister's fears were not without cause. "Well, well," says she, "but I hope you will not be tempted with such a horrid example as that." And as soon as the minister was gone, she told me she would not have me discouraged, for perhaps ways and means might be found out to dispose of me in a particular way by myself, of which she would talk further to me afterward. I looked earnestly at her, and I thought she looked more cheerful than she usually had done, and I entertained immediately 1,000 notions of being delivered, but could not for the life image the methods, or think of one that was the least feasible. But I was too much concerned in it to let her go from me without explaining herself, which, though she was very loath to do, yet my importunity prevailed, and while I was still pressing, she answered me in a few words thus: "Why, you have money, have you not? Did you ever know one in your life that was transported and had 100 pounds in his pocket? I'll warrant you, child," says she. I understood her presently, but told her I would leave all that to her, and I saw no room to hope for anything but a strict execution of the order. And as it was a severity that was esteemed a mercy, there was no doubt but it would be strictly observed. She said no more than this: "We will try what we can be done," and so we parted for that night. I lay in the prison near 15 weeks after this order for transportation was signed. What the reason of it was I know not, but at the end of this time I was put on board a ship in the Thames, and with me a gang of 13 as hardened, vile creatures as ever Newgate produced in my time, and it would really well take up a history longer than mine to describe the degrees of impudence and audacious villainy that those 13 were arrived to, and the manner of their behavior in the voyage, of which I have a very diverting account by me, which the captain of the ship who carried them over gave me the minutes of, and which he caused his mate to write down at large. It may perhaps be thought trifling to enter here into a relation of all the little incidents which attended me in this interval of my circumstances, I mean between the final order of my transportation and the time of my going on board the ship, and I am too near the end of my story to allow room for it. But something relating to me and my Lancashire husband I must not omit. He had, as I have observed already, been carried from the master's side of the ordinary prison into the press yard, with 3 of his comrades, for they found another to add to them after some time. Here, for what reason I knew not, they were kept in custody without being brought to trial almost 3 months. It seems they found means to bribe or buy off some of those who were expected to come in against them, and they were wanted evidence for some time to convict them. After some puzzle on this account, at first they made a shift to get proof enough against 2 of them to carry them off, but the other 2, of which my Lancashire husband was one, lay still in suspense. They had, I think, one positive evidence against each of them, but the law strictly obliging them to have 2 witnesses, they could make nothing of it. Yet it seems they were resolved not to part with the men neither, not doubting but a further evidence would at last come in, and in order to this, I think publication was made, that such prisoners being taken, any one that had been robbed by them might come to the prison and see them. I took this opportunity to satisfy my curiosity, pretending that I had been robbed in the Dunstable coach, and that I would go to see the 2 highwaymen. But when I came into the press yard, I so disguised myself and muffled my face up so that he could see little of me, and consequently knew nothing of who I was. And when I came back, I said publicly that I knew them very well. Immediately it was rumored all over the prison that Moll Flanders would turn evidence against one of the highwaymen, and that I was to come off by it from the sentence of transportation. They heard of it, and immediately my husband desired to see this Mrs. Flanders that knew him so well, and was to be in evidence against him, and accordingly I had leave given to go to him. I dressed myself up as well as the best clothes that I had suffered myself ever to appear in there would allow me, and went to the press yard, and had for some time a hood over my face. He said little to me at first, and asked me if I knew him. I told him yes, very well, but as I concealed my face, so I counterfeited my voice, that he had not the least guess at who I was. He asked me where I had seen him. I told him between Dunstable and Brickhill, but turning to the keeper that stood by, I asked if I might not be admitted to talk with him alone. He said yes, as much as I pleased, and so very civilly withdrew. As soon as he was gone, I had shut the door. I threw off my hood, and bursting out into tears, "My dear," says I, "do you not know me?" He turned pale and stood speechless, like one thunderstruck, and not able to conquer the surprise. Said no more but this, "Let me sit down," and sitting down by a table, he laid his elbow upon the table, and leaning his head on his hand, fixed his eyes on the ground as one stupid. I cried so vehemently, on the other hand, that it was a good while ere I could speak any more, and after I had given some vent to my passion by tears, I repeated the same words, "My dear, do you not know me?" At which he answered, "Yes," and said no more a good while. After some time continuing in the surprise as above, he cast up his eyes towards me and said, "How could you be so cruel?" I did not readily understand what he meant, and I answered, "How can you call me cruel? What have I been cruel to you in? To come to me," says he, "in such a place as this, is it not to insult me? I have not robbed you, at least not on the highway." I perceived by this that he knew nothing of the miserable circumstances I was in, and thought that having got some intelligence of his being there, I had come to upbraid him with his leaving me. But I had too much to say to him to be affronted, and told him in few words that I was far from coming to insult him, but at best I came to condole mutually, that he would be easily satisfied that I had no such view, when I should tell him that my condition was worse than his, and that many ways. He looked a little concerned at the general expression of my condition being worse than his, but with a kind smile looked a little wildly, and said, "How can that be, when you see me fettered, and in Newgate, and 2 of my companions executed already? Can you say your condition is worse than mine?" "Come, my dear," says I, "we have a long piece of work to do, if I should be to relate, or you to hear, my unfortunate history. But if you are disposed to hear it, you will soon conclude with me that my condition is worse than yours." "How is that possible," says he again, "when I expect to be cast for my life the very next sessions?" "Yes," says I, "'tis very possible, when I shall tell you that I have been cast for my life 3 sessions ago, and am under sentence of death. Is not my case worse than yours?" Then indeed He stood silent again, like one struck dumb, and after a while he starts up. "Unhappy couple," says he, "how can this be possible?" I took him by the hand. "Come, my dear," said I, "sit down and let us compare our sorrows. I am a prisoner in this very house, and in much worse circumstances than you, and you will be satisfied I do not come to insult you when I tell you the particulars." And with this we sat together, and I told him so much of my story as I thought was convenient, bringing it at last to my being reduced to great poverty, and representing myself as fallen into some company that led me to relieve my distresses by way that I had been utterly unacquainted with, and that they making an attempt at a tradesman's house, I was seized upon for having been but just at the door, the maidservant pulling me in, that I neither had broken any lock nor taken anything away, and that notwithstanding that I was brought in guilty and sentenced to die, but that the judges, having been made sensible of the hardship of my circumstances, had obtained leave to remit the sentence upon my consenting to be transported. I told him I fared the worse for being taken in the prison for one Moll Flanders, who was a famous successful thief, that all of them had heard of, but none of them had ever seen, but that, as he knew well, was none of my name. But I placed all to the account of my ill fortune, and that under this name I was dealt with as an old offender, though this was the first thing they had ever known of me. I gave him a long particular of things that had befallen me since I saw him, but I told him if I had seen him since he might think I had, and then gave him an account how I had seen him at Brickhill, how furiously he was pursued, and how, by giving an account that I knew him, and that he was a very honest gentleman, one Mr. The hue and cry was stopped, and the high constable went back again. He listened most attentively to all my story, and smiled at most of the particulars, being all of them petty matters and infinitely below what he had been at the head of. But when I came to the story of Brickhill, he was surprised. "And was it you, my dear," said he, "that gave the check to the mob that was at our heels there at Brickhill?" "Yes," said I, "it was I indeed." And then I told him the particulars which I had observed him there. "Why, then," he said, "it was you that saved my life at that time, and I am glad I owe my life to you, for I will pay the debt to you now, and I'll deliver you from the present condition you are in, or I will die in the attempt." I told him, by no means. It was a risk too great, not worth his running the hazard of, and for a life not worth his saving. "'Twas no matter for that," he said. "It was a life worth all the world to him, a life that had given him a new life. For," says he, "I was never in real danger of being taken, but that time, till the last minute when I was taken. Indeed, he told me his danger then lay in his believing he had not been pursued that way, for they had gone from Hockey quite another way, and had come over the enclosed country into Brickhill, not by the road, and were sure they had not been seen by anybody." Here he gave me a long history of his life, which indeed would make a very strange history and be infinitely diverting. He told me he took to the road about 12 years before he married me, that the woman which called him brother was not really his sister or any kin to him, but one that belonged to their gang, and who, keeping correspondence with him, lived always in town, having good store of acquaintance, that she gave them a perfect intelligence of persons going out of town, and that they had made several good booties by her correspondence, that she thought she had fixed a fortune for him when she brought me to him, but happened to be disappointed, which he really could not blame her for, that if it was his good luck that I had had the estate, which he was informed I had, he had resolved to leave off the road and live a retired, sober life, but never to appear in public till some general pardon had been passed, or till he could for money have got his name into some particular pardon, that so he might have been perfectly easy, but that, as it had proved otherwise, he was obliged to put off his equipage and take on the old trade again, He gave me a long account of some of his adventures, and particularly one when he robbed the Westchester coaches near Lichfield, when he got a very great booty, and after that how he robbed 5 gracious in the West, going to Bird Fair in Wiltshire to buy sheep. He told me he got so much money on those 2 occasions that if he had known where to have found me, he would certainly have embraced my proposal of going with me to Virginia, or to have settled in a plantation on some other parts of the English colonies in America. He told me he wrote 2 or 3 letters to me, directed according to my order, but heard nothing from me. This I indeed knew to be true, but the letters coming to my hand in the time of my latter husband, I could do nothing in it, and therefore chose to give no answer, that so he might rather believe they had miscarried. Being thus disappointed, he said, he carried on the old trade ever since, though when he had gotten so much money, he said, he did not run such desperate risks as he did before. Then he gave me some accounts of several hard and desperate encounters which he had had with gentlemen on the road, who parted too hardly with their money, and showed me some wounds he had received, and he had 1 or 2 very terrible wounds indeed, as particularly one by a pistol bullet, which broke his arm, and another with a sword, which ran him quite through the body, but that missing his vitals he was cured again. One of his comrades having kept with him so faithfully and so friendly as that he assisted him in riding near 80 miles before his arm was set, and then got a surgeon in a considerable city remote from that place where it was done, pretending they were gentlemen traveling towards Carlisle, and that they had been attacked on the road by highwaymen, and that one of them had shot him in the arm and broke the bone. This, he said, his friend managed so well that they were not suspected at all, but lay still till he was perfectly cured. He gave me so many distinct accounts of his adventures that it is with great reluctance that I decline the relating them, but I consider that this is my story, not his. I then inquired into the circumstances of his present case at that time, and what it was he expected when he came to be tried. He told me they had no evidence against him, or but very little, for that of 3 robberies which they were all charged with. It was his good fortune that he was but in one of them, and that there was but 1 witness to be had for that fact, which was not sufficient, but that it was expected some others would come in against him. That he thought, indeed, when he first saw me, that I had been one that came of that errand, and that if somebody came in against him, he hoped he should be cleared. That he had some intimation that if he would submit to transport himself, he might be admitted to it without a trial, and that he could not think of it with any temper, and thought he could much easier submit to be hanged. I blamed him for that, and told him I blamed him on 2 accounts. First, because if he was transported, there might be 100 ways for him that was a gentleman and a bold, enterprising man to find his way back again, and perhaps some ways and means to come back before he went. He smiled at that part, and said he should like the last the best of the 2, for he had a kind of horror upon his mind at his being sent over to the plantations, as Romans sent condemned slaves to work in the mines, that he thought the passage into another state, let it be what it would, much more tolerable at the gallows, and that this was the general notion of all the gentlemen who were driven by the exigence of their fortunes to take the road, that at the place of execution there was at least an end of all the miseries of the present state, and as for what was to follow, a man was, in his opinion, as likely to repent sincerely in the last fortnight of his life under the pressures and agonies of a jail and the condemned hole as he would ever be in the woods and wilderness of America, that servitude and hard labor were things gentlemen could never stoop to, that it was but the way to force them to be their own executioners afterwards, which was much worse, and that therefore he could not have any patience when he did but think of being transported. I used the utmost of my endeavor to persuade him, and joined that known woman's rhetoric to it. I mean, that of tears. I told him the infamy of a public execution was certainly a greater pressure upon the spirits of a gentleman than any of the mortifications that he could meet with abroad could be, that he had at least in the other a chance for his life, whereas here he had none at all, that it was the easiest thing in the world for him to manage the captain of a ship, who were, generally speaking, men of good humor and some gallantry, and a small matter of conduct, especially if there was any money to be had, would make way for him to buy himself off when he came to Virginia. He looked wistfully at me, and I thought I guessed at what he meant, that is to say, that he had no money. But I was mistaken. His meaning was another way. "You hinted just now, my dear," said he, "that there might be a way of coming back before I went, by which I understood you that I might be possible to buy it off here. I had rather give £200 to prevent going than £100 to be set at liberty when I came there." "That is, my dear," said I, "because you do not know the place as well as I do." "That may be," said he, "and yet I believe, as well as you know it, you would do the same unless it is because, as you told me, you have a mother there." I told him as to my mother, it was next to impossible but that she must be dead many years before, and as for any other relations that I might have there, I knew them not now, that since the misfortunes I had been under had reduced me to the condition I had been in for some years, I had not kept up any correspondence with them, and that he could easily believe. I should find but a cold reception from them if I should be put to make my first visit in the condition of a transported felon, that therefore, if I went thither, I resolved not to see them, but that I had many views in going there. If it should be my fate, which took off all the uneasy part of it, and if he found himself obliged to go also, I should easily instruct him how to manage himself, so as never to go as a servant at all, especially since I found he was not destitute of money, which was the only friend in such a condition. He smiled, and said he did not tell me he had money. I took him up short, and told him I hoped he did not understand by my speaking that I should expect any supply from him if he had money; that on the other hand, though I had not a great deal, yet I did not want, and while I had any I would rather add to him than weaken him in that article, seeing whatever he had, I knew in the case of transportation he would have occasion of it all. He expressed himself in a most tender manner upon that head. He told me what money he had was not a great deal, but that he would never hide any of it from me if I wanted it, and that he assured me he did not speak with any such apprehensions, that he was only intent upon what I had hinted to him before he went, that here he knew what to do with himself, but that there he should be the most ignorant, helpless wretch alive. I told him he frightened and terrified himself with that which had no terror in it, that if he had money, as I was glad to hear he had, he might not only avoid the servitude supposed to be the consequence of transportation, but begin the world upon a new foundation, and that such a one as he could not fail of success in, with the common application usual in such cases, that he could not but call to mind that what I had recommended to him many years before, and had proposed it for our mutual subsistence and restoring our fortunes in the world. And I would tell him now that to convince him both of the certainty of it and of my being fully acquainted with the method, and also fully satisfied in the probability of success, he should first see me deliver myself from the necessity of going over it all, and then that I would go with him freely and of my own choice, and perhaps carry enough with me to satisfy him that I did not offer it for want of being able to live without assistance from him, but that I thought our mutual misfortunes had been such as were sufficient to reconcile us both to quitting this part of the world, and living where nobody could upbraid us with what was past, or we be in any dread of a prison, and without agonies of a condemned hole to drive us to it. This, where we should look back on all our past disasters with infinite satisfaction, when we should consider that our enemies should entirely forget us, and that we should live as new people in the new world, nobody having anything to say to us, or we to them. I pressed this home to him with so many arguments, and answered all his own passionate objections so effectively, that he embraced me, and told me I treated him with such sincerity and affection as overcame him, that he would take my advice, and would strive to submit to his fate in hope of having the comfort of my assistance, and of so faithful a counselor and such a companion in his misery. But still he put me in mind of what I had mentioned before, namely, that there might be some way to get off before he went, and that he might be possible to avoid going at all, which he said would be much better. I told him he should see and be fully satisfied, that I would do my utmost in that part too, and if it did not succeed, yet that I would make good the rest. We parted after this long conference with such testimonies of kindness and affection as I thought were equal, if not superior, to that of our parting at Dunstable. And now I saw more plainly than before the reason why he declined coming at that time any farther with me toward London than Dunstable, and why, when we parted there, he told me it was not convenient for him to come part of the way to London to bring me going, as he would otherwise have done. I have observed that the account of his life would have made a much more pleasing history than this of mine, and indeed nothing in it was more strange than this part, that he carried on that desperate trade full 25 years, and had never been taken. The success he had met with had been so very uncommon, and such that sometimes he had lived handsomely and retired in a place for a year or two at a time, keeping himself in a manservant to wait on him, and had often sat in the coffee-houses and heard the very people whom he had robbed give accounts of their being robbed, and of the place and circumstances, so that he could easily remember that it was the same. In this manner, it seems, he lived near Liverpool at the time he unluckily married me for a fortune. Had I been the fortune he expected, I verily believe, as he said, that he would have taken up and lived honestly all his days. He had, with the rest of his misfortunes, the good luck not to be actually upon the spot when the robbery was done which he was committed for, and so none of the persons robbed could swear to him or had anything to charge upon him. But it seems as if he were taken with the gang. One hard-mouthed countryman swore home to him, and they were like to have others come in according to the publication they have made, so that they expected more evidence against him, and for that reason he was kept in hold. However, the offer which was made to him of admitting him to transportation was made, as I understood, upon the intercession of some great person who pressed him hard to accept of it before a trial. And indeed, as he knew there were several that might come in against him, I thought his friend was in the right, and I lay at him night and day to delay it no longer. At last, with much difficulty, he gave his consent, and as he was not therefore admitted to transportation in court, and on his petition as I was, so he found himself under a difficulty. To avoid embarking himself, as I had said he might have done, his great friend, who was his intercessor for the favor of that grant, having given security for him that he should transport himself and not return within the term. This hardship broke all my measures, for the steps I took afterwards for my own deliverance were hereby rendered wholly ineffectual, unless I would abandon him and leave him to go to America by himself, than which he protested he would much rather venture, although he were certain to go directly to the gallows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 22. I must now return to my case. The time of my being transported according to my sentence was near at hand. My governess, who continued my fast friend, had tried to obtain a pardon, but it could not be done unless with an expense too heavy for my purse, considering that to be left naked and empty, unless I had resolved to return to my old trade again, had been worse than my transportation, because there I knew I could live. Here I could not. The good minister stood very hard on another account to prevent my being transported also, but he was answered that indeed my life had been given me at his first solicitations, and therefore he ought to ask no more. He was sensibly grieved at my going, because, as he said, he feared I should lose the good impressions which a prospect of death had at first made on me, and which were since increased by his instructions, and the pious gentleman was exceedingly concerned about me on that account. On the other hand, I really was not solicitous about it, as I was before, but I industriously concealed my reasons for it from the minister, and to the last he did not know but that I went with the utmost reluctance and affliction. It was in the month of February that I was, with 7 other convicts, as they called us, delivered to a merchant that traded to Virginia on board a ship, riding, as they called it, in Deptford Reach. The officer of the prison delivered us on board, and the master of the vessel gave a discharge for us. We were, for that night, clapped under hatches and kept so close that I thought I should have been suffocated for want of air. And the next morning the ship weighed and fell down the river to a place they called Bugby's Hole, which was done, as they told us, by the agreement of the merchant, that all opportunity of escape should be taken from us. However, when the ship came thither and cast anchor, we were allowed more liberty, and particularly were permitted to come up on the deck, but not up on the quarter-deck, that being kept particularly for the captain and 4 passengers. When by the noise of the men over my head and the motion of the ship I perceived that they were under sail, I was at first greatly surprised, fearing we should go away directly, and that our friends would not be admitted to see us any more. But I was easy soon after, when I found they had come to an anchor again, and soon after that we had notice given by some of the men where we were, that the next morning we should have the liberty to come up on deck, and to have our friends come and see us, if we had any. All that night I lay upon the hard boards of the deck, as the passengers did, but we had afterwards the liberty of little cabins for such of us as had any bedding to lay in them, and room to stow any box or trunk for clothes and linen, if we had it, which might well be put in, for some of them had neither shirt nor shift, or a rag of linen or woolen, but what was on their backs, and a farthing of money to help themselves. And yet I did not find but they fared well enough in the ship, especially the women, who got money from the seamen for washing their clothes, sufficient to purchase any common things that they wanted. When the next morning we had the liberty to come up on the deck, I asked one of the officers of the ship whether I might not have the liberty to send a letter on shore, to let my friends know where the ship lay, and to get some necessary things sent to me. This was, it seems, the boatswain. a very civil, courteous sort of man, who told me that I should have that or any other liberty that I desired, that he could allow me with safety. I told him I desired no other, and he answered that the ship's boat would go up to London the next tide, and he would order my letter to be carried. Accordingly, when the boat went off, the boatswain came to me and told me the boat was going off, and that he went in it himself, and asked me if my letter was ready, so he would take care of it. I had prepared myself, you may be sure, pen, ink, and paper beforehand, and I had gotten a letter ready, directed to my governess, and enclosed another for my fellow prisoner, which, however, I did not let her know was my husband, not to the last. In that to my governess, I let her know where the ship lay, and pressed her earnestly to send me what things I knew she had got ready for me for my voyage. When I gave the boatswain the letter, I gave him a shilling with it, which I told him was for the charge of a messenger or porter, which I entreated him to send with the letter as soon as he came on shore, that if possible I might have an answer brought back by the same hand, and I might know what was become of my things. For, sir, says I, if the ship should go away before I have them on board, I am undone. I took care, when I gave him the shilling, to let him see that I had a little better furniture about me than the ordinary prisoners, for he saw that I had a purse, and in it a pretty deal of money, and I found that the very sight of it immediately furnished me with a very different treatment from what I should otherwise have met with in the ship. For though he was very courteous indeed before, in a kind of natural compassion to me, as a woman in distress, yet he was more than ordinarily so afterwards, and procured me to be better treated in the ship than, I say, I might otherwise have been, as shall appear in its place. He very honestly had my letter delivered to my governess's own hand, and brought me back an answer from her in writing, and when he gave me the answer, gave me the shilling again. "There," says he, "there's your shilling again, too, for I delivered the letter myself." I could not tell what to say, I was so surprised at the thing, but after some pause I said, "Sir, you are too kind. It had been but reasonable that you had paid yourself coach hire then." "No, no," says he, "I am overpaid." "What is the gentlewoman, your sister?" "No, sir," says I, "she is no relation to me, but she is a dear friend, and all the friends I have in the world." "Well," says he, "there are few such friends in the world. Why, she cried after you like a child." "Aye," says I again, "she would give £100, I believe, to deliver me from this dreadful condition I am in." "Would she so?" says he. "For half the money I believe I could put you in a way how to deliver yourself." But this he spoke softly, that nobody could hear. "Alas, sir," said I, "but then that must be such a deliverance as, if I should be taken again, would cost me my life." "Nay," said he, "if you were once out of the ship, you must look to yourself afterwards. That I can say nothing to," so we dropped the discourse for that time. In the meantime, my governess, faithful to the last moment, conveyed my letter to the prison to my husband, and got an answer to it, and the next day came down herself to the ship, bringing me, in the first place, a sea-bed, as they call it, and all its furniture, such as was convenient, but not to let the people think it was extraordinary. She brought with her a sea-chest, that is, a chest such as are made for seamen, with all the conveniences in it, and filled with everything almost that I could want. And in one of the corners of the chest, where there was a private drawer, was a bank of money. This is to say, so much of it as I had resolved to carry with me, for I ordered a part of my stock to be left behind me, to be sent afterwards in such goods as I should want when I came to settle. For money in that country is not of much use where all things are bought for tobacco. Much more is it a great loss to carry it from hence. But my case was particular. It was by no means proper for me to go thither without money or goods, and for a poor convict that was to be sold as soon as I came on shore. To carry with me a cargo of goods would be to have notice taken of it, and perhaps to have them seized by the public. So I took part of my stock with me thus, and left the other part with my governess. My governess brought me a great many other things, but it was not proper for me to look too well provided in the ship, at least till I knew what kind of a captain we should have. When she came into the ship, I thought she would have died indeed. Her heart sank at the sight of me, and at the thoughts of parting with me in that condition, and she cried so intolerably I could not for a long time have any talk with her. I took that time to read my fellow prisoner's letter, which, however, greatly perplexed me. He told me he was determined to go, but found it would be impossible for him to be discharged time enough for going in the same ship, and which was more than all, he began to question whether they would give him leave to go in what ship he pleased, though he did voluntarily transport himself, but that they would see him put on board such a ship as they should direct, and that he would be charged upon the captain as other convict prisoners were, so that he began to be in despair of seeing me till he came to Virginia, which made him almost desperate, seeing that, on the other hand, if I should not be there, if any accident of the sea or of mortality should take me away, he should be the most undone creature in the world. This was very perplexing, and I knew not what course to take. I told my governess the story of the bo'sun, and she was mighty eager for me to treat him, but I had no mind to it, till I heard whether my husband or fellow prisoner, so she called to him, could be at liberty to go with me or no. At last I was forced to let her into the whole matter, except only that of his being my husband. I told her I had made a positive bargain or agreement with him to go, if he could get the liberty of going in the same ship, and that I found he had money. Then I read a long lecture to her of what I proposed to do when we came there, how we could plant, settle, and, in short, grow rich, without any more adventures, and, as a great secret, I told her that we were to marry as soon as he came on board. She soon agreed cheerfully to my going when she heard this, and she made it her business from that time to get him out of the prison in time, so that he might go in the same ship with me, which at last was brought to pass, though with great difficulty, and not without all the forms of a transported prisoner convict, which he really was not yet, for he had not been tried, and which was of great mortification to him. As our fate was now determined, and we were both on board, actually bound to Virginia, in the despicable quality of transported convicts destined to be sold for slaves, I for 5 years, and he under bonds and security, not to return to England any more, as long as he lived, he was very much dejected and cast down. The mortification of being brought on board, as he was, like a prisoner, piqued him very much, since it was first told him he should transport himself, and so that he might go as a gentleman at liberty. It is true he was not ordered to be sold when he came there, as it were, and for that reason he was obliged to pay for his passage to the captain, which we were not. As to the rest, he was as much at a loss as a child what to do with himself, or with what he had, but by directions. Our first business was to compare our stock. He was very honest with me, and told me his stock was pretty good when he came into the prison, but the living there as he did in a figure like a gentleman, and, which was 10 times as much, the making of friends and soliciting his case, had been very expensive, and in a word all his stock that had left was 108 pounds, which he had about him, all in gold. I gave him an account of my stock as faithfully, that is to say, of what I had taken to carry with me, for I was resolved, whatever should happen, to keep what I had left with my governess in reserve, that in case I should die, what I had with me was enough to give him, and that which was left in my governess's hands would be her own, which she had well deserved of me indeed. My stock which I had with me was 246 pounds some odd shillings, so that we had 354 pounds between us. But a worse gotten estate was scarce ever put together to being the world with. Our greatest misfortune as to our stock was that it was all in money, which everyone knows is an unprofitable cargo to be carried to the plantations. I believe his was really all he had left in the world, as he told me it was, but I, who had between 700 and 800 pounds in bank when this disaster befell me, and who had one of the faithfulest friends in the world to manage it for me, considered she was a woman of manner, of religious principles, had still 300 pounds left in her hand, which I reserved as above, besides some very valuable things, as particularly 2 gold watches, some small pieces of plate, and some rings, all stolen goods. The plate, rings, and watches were put in my chest with the money, and with this fortune, and in the 61st year of my age, I launched out into a new world, as I may call it, in the condition, as to what appeared, only of a poor naked convict, ordered to be transported in respite from the gallows. My clothes were poor and mean, but not ragged or dirty, and none knew in the whole ship that I had anything of value about me. However, as I had a great many very good clothes and linen in abundance, which I had ordered to be packed up in 2 great boxes, I had them shipped on board, not as my goods, but as consigned to my real name in Virginia, and had the bills of loading signed by the captain in my pocket. And in these boxes was my plate and watches and everything of value except my money, which I kept by itself in a private drawer in my chest, which could not be found or opened if found, with splitting the chest to pieces. In this condition I lay for 3 weeks in the ship, not knowing whether I should have my husband with me or no, and therefore not resolving how or in what manner to receive the honest boatswain's proposal, which indeed he thought a little strange at first. At the end of this time, behold my husband come on board. He looked with a dejected, angry countenance. His great heart was swelled with rage and disdain, to be dragged along with 3 keepers of Newgate, and put on board like a convict, when he had not so much as been brought to trial. He made loud complaints of it by his friends, for it seems he had some interest, but his friends got some check in their application, and were told he had had favor enough, and that they had received such an account of him since the last grant of his transportation, that he ought to think himself very well treated that he was not prosecuted anew. This answer quieted him at once, for he knew too much what might have happened, and what he had room to expect, and now he saw the goodness of the advice to him, which prevailed with him to accept of the offer of a voluntary transportation. And after this, his chagrin at these hellhounds, as he called them, was a little over. He looked a little composed, began to be cheerful, and as I was telling him how glad I was to have him once more out of their hands, he took me in his arms, and acknowledged with great tenderness that I had given him the best advice possible. "My dear," says he, "thou hast twice saved my life. From henceforward it shall be all employed for you, and I'll always take your advice." The ship began now to fill. Several passengers came on board. We were embarked on no criminal account, and these had accommodations assigned to them in the great cabin and other parts of the ship, whereas we as convicts were thrust down below, I know not where. But when my husband came on board, I spoke to the boatswain, who had so early given me hints of his friendship in carrying my letter. I told him he had befriended me in many things, and I had not made any suitable return to him. And with that I put a guinea into his hand. I told him that my husband was now come on board, that though we were both under the present misfortune, Yet we had been persons of a different character from the wretched crew that we came with, and desired to know of him whether the captain might not be moved to admit us to some conveniences in the ship, for which we would make him what satisfaction he pleased, and that we would gratify him for his pains in procuring this for us. He took the guinea, as I could see, with great satisfaction, and assured me of his assistance. Then he told us he did not doubt but that the captain, who was one of the best humoured gentlemen in the world, would be easily brought to accommodate us as well as we could desire, and to make me easy, told me he would go up the next tide on purpose to speak to the captain about it. The next morning, happening to sleep a little longer than ordinary, when I got up and began to look abroad, I saw the bo'sun among the men in his ordinary business. I was a little melancholy at seeing him there, and going forward to speak to him, he saw me and came towards me, but not giving him time to speak first, I said, smiling, "I doubt, sir, you have forgot us, for I see you are very busy." He returned presently. "Come along with me, and you shall see." So he took me into the great cabin, and there sat a good sort of a gentlemanly man for a seaman, writing, and with a great many papers before him. "Here," says the bo'sun to him that was a-writing, "is the gentlewoman that the captain spoke to you of." And turning to me, he said, "I have been so far from forgetting your business that I have been up at the captain's house, and have represented faithfully to the captain what you said, relating to you being furnished with better conveniences for yourself and your husband. And the captain has sent this gentleman, who is mate of the ship, down with me on purpose to show you everything, and to accommodate you fully to your content, and bid me assure you that you shall not be treated like what you were at first expected to be, but with the same respect as other passengers are treated." The mate then spoke to me, and, not giving me time to thank the bo'sun for his kindness, confirmed what the bo'sun had said, and added that it was the captain's delight to show himself kind and charitable, especially to those that were under any misfortunes. And with that he showed me several cabins built up, some in the great cabin, and some partitioned off, out of the steerage, but opening into the great cabin on purpose for the accommodation of passengers, and gave me leave to choose where I would. However, I chose a cabin which opened into the steerage, in which was very good convenience to set our chest and boxes, and a table to eat on. The mate then told me that the bo'sun had given so good a character of me and my husband as to our civil behavior, that he had orders to tell me we should eat with him, if we thought fit, during the whole voyage, on the common terms of passengers, that we may lay in some fresh provisions if we pleased, or if not, he should lay in his usual store, and we should have share with him. This was very reviving news to me, after so many hardships and afflictions as I had gone through of late. I thanked him, and told him the captain should make his own terms with us, and asked him leave to go and tell my husband of it, who was not very well, and was not yet out of his cabin. Accordingly I went, and my husband, whose spirits were still so much sunk with the indignity, as he understood it, offered him, that he was scarce yet himself, was so revived with the account that I gave him of the reception we were like to have in the ship, that he was quite another man, and new vigor and courage appeared in his very countenance. So true is it that the greatest of spirits, when overwhelmed by their afflictions, are subject to the greatest dejections, and are the most apt to despair and give themselves up. After some little pause to recover himself, my husband came up with me, and gave the mate thanks for his kindness which he had expressed to us, and sent suitable acknowledgment by him to the captain, offering to pay him by advance whatever he demanded for our passage and for the conveniences he had helped us to. The mate told him that the captain would be on board in the afternoon, and that he would leave all that till he came. Accordingly, in the afternoon the captain came, and we found him the same courteous, obliging man that the bo'sun had represented him to be. and he was so well pleased with my husband's conversation that, in short, he would not let us keep the cabin we had chosen, but gave us one that, as I said before, opened into the great cabin. Nor were his conditions exorbitant, for the man craving and eager to make a prey of us. But for 15 guineas we had our whole passage and provisions and cabin, ate at the captain's table, and were very handsomely entertained. The captain lay himself in the other part of the great cabin, having let his round house, as they call it, to a rich planter who went over with his wife and 3 children, who ate by themselves. He had some other ordinary passengers who quartered in the steerage, and as for our old fraternity, they were kept under the hatches while the ship lay there, and came very little on the deck. I could not refrain acquainting my governess with what had happened. It was but just that she, who was so really concerned for me, should have part in my good fortune. Besides, I wanted her assistance to supply me with several necessaries, which before I was shy of letting anybody see me have, that it might not be public. But now I had a cabin and room to set things in. I ordered abundance of good things for our comfort in the voyage, as brandy, sugar, lemons, etc., to make punch and treat our benefactor, the captain, and abundance of things for eating and drinking in the voyage, also a larger bed, and bedding proportioned to it, so that, in a word, we resolved to want for nothing in the voyage. All this while I had provided nothing for our assistance when we should come to the place and begin to call ourselves planters, and I was far from being ignorant of what was needful on that occasion, particularly all sorts of tools for the planters' work and for building, and all kinds of furniture for our dwelling, which, if to be bought in the country, must necessarily cost double the price. So I discoursed that point with my governess, and she went and waited upon the captain, and told him that she hoped ways might be found out for her 2 unfortunate cousins, as she called us, to obtain our freedom when we came into the country, and so entered into a discourse with him about the means and terms also, of which I shall say more in its place. And after thus sounding the captain, she let him know, though we were unhappy in the circumstances that occasioned our going, yet that we were not unfurnished to set ourselves to work in the country, and we resolved to settle and live there as planters, if we might be put in a way how to do it. The captain readily offered his assistance, told her the method of entering upon such business, and how easy, nay, how certain it was for industrious people to recover their fortunes in such a manner. "Madam," says he, "'tis no reproach to any man in that country to have been sent over in worse circumstances than I perceive your cousins are in, provided they do but apply with diligence and good judgment to the business of that place when they come there." She then inquired of him what things it was necessary we should carry over with us, and he, like a very honest as well as knowing man, told her thus: "Madam, your cousins in the first place must procure somebody to buy them as servants, in conformity to the conditions of their transportation, and then in the name of that person they may go about what they will. They may either purchase some plantations already begun, or they may purchase land of the government of the country, and begin where they please, and both will be done reasonably." She bespoke his favor in the first article, which he promised to her to take upon himself, and indeed faithfully performed it. And as to the rest, he promised to recommend us to such as should give us the best advice, and not to impose upon us, which was as much as could be desired. She then asked him if it would be necessary to furnish us with a stock of tools and materials for the business of planting, and he said yes, by all means, and then she begged his assistance in it. She told him she would furnish us with everything that was convenient, whatever it cost her. He accordingly gave her a long particular of things necessary for a planter, which by his account came to about 80 or 100 pounds, and, in short, she went about as dexterously to buy them as if she had been an old Virginia merchant, only that she bought, by my direction, above twice as much of everything as he had given her a list of. These she put on board in her own name, took his bills of loading for them, and endorsed those bills of loading to my husband, insuring the cargo afterwards in her own name by our order, so that we were provided for all events and for all disasters. I should have told you that my husband gave her all of his stock of 108 pounds, which, as I have said, he had about him in gold, to lay out thus, and I gave her a good sum besides, so that I did not break into the stock which I had left in her hands at all, but after we had sorted out our whole cargo, we had yet near 200 pounds in money, which was more than enough for our purpose. In this condition, very cheerful and indeed joyful at being so happily accommodated as we were, we set sail from Bugsby's Hold to Gravesend, where the ship lay about 10 more days, and where the captain came on board for good and all. Here the captain offered us a civility which indeed we had no reason to expect, namely to let us go on shore and refresh ourselves, upon giving our words in a solemn manner that we would not go from him, and that we would return peaceably on board again. This was such an evidence of his confidence in us that it overcame my husband, who, in a mere principle of gratitude, told him, as he could not be in any capacity to make a suitable return for such a favor, so he could not think of accepting of it, nor could he be easy that the captain should run such a risk. After some mutual civilities, I gave my husband a purse in which was 80 guineas, and he put it into the captain's hands. "There, captain," says he, "there's part of a pledge for our fidelity. If we deal dishonestly with you on any account, 'tis your own." And on this we went on shore. Indeed, the captain had assurance enough of our resolutions to go, for that having made such provision to settle there, it did not seem rational that we would choose to remain here at the expense and peril of life, for such it must have been if we had been taken again. In a word, we went all on shore with the captain, and supped together at Gravesend, where we were very merry, stayed all night, lay at the house where we supped, and came all very honestly on board again with him in the morning. Here we bought 10 dozen bottles of good beer, some wine, some fowls, and such things as we thought might be acceptable on board. My governess was with us all this while, and went with us round into the Downs, as did also the captain's wife, with whom she went back. I was never so sorrowful at parting with my own mother as I was at parting with her, and I never saw her more. We had a fair easterly wind sprung up the 3rd day after we came to the Downs, and we sailed from thence the 10th of April. Nor did we touch any more at any place till, being driven on the coast of Ireland by a very hard gale of wind, the ship came to another anchor in a little bay near the mouth of a river, whose name I remember not, but they said the river came down from Limerick, and that it was the largest river in Ireland. Here, being detained by bad weather for some time, the captain, who continued the same kind, good-humoured man as at first, took us two on shore with him again. He did it now in kindness to my husband, indeed, who bore the sea very ill and was very sick, especially when it blew so hard. Here we bought in again a store of fresh provisions, especially beef, pork, mutton, and fowls, and the captain stayed to pickle up 5 or 6 barrels of beef to lengthen out the ship's store. We were here not above 5 days, when the weather turned mild, and a fair wind we set sail again, and in 42 days came safe to the coast of Virginia. When we drew near to the shore, the captain called me to him, and told me that he found by my discourse I had some relations in the place, and that I had been there before, and so he supposed I understood the custom in their disposing the convict prisoners when they arrived. I told him I did not, and that as to what relations I had in the place, he might be sure I would make myself known to none of them, while I was in the circumstances of a prisoner, and that as to the rest, we left ourselves entirely to him to assist us, as he was pleased to promise us he would do. He told me I must get somebody in the place to come and buy us as servants. I told him we should do as he should direct, so he brought a planter to treat with him, as it were, for the purchase of these 2 servants, my husband and me, and there we were formally sold to him and went ashore with him. The captain went with us and carried us to a certain house. Whether it was to be called a tavern or not, I know not, but we had a bowl of punch there made of rum, etc., and were very merry. After some time the planter gave us a certificate of discharge and an acknowledgment of having served him faithfully, and we were free from him the next morning to go whither we would. For this piece of service the captain demanded of us 6,000 weight of tobacco, which he said he was accountable for to his freighter, and which we immediately bought for him, and made him a present of 20 guineas besides, with which he was abundantly satisfied. It is not proper to enter here into the particulars of what part of the colony of Virginia we settled in, for divers reasons. It may suffice to mention that we went into the great river Potomac, the ship being bound thither, and there we intended to have settled first, though afterwards we altered our minds. The first thing I did of moment, after having gotten all our goods on shore, and placed them in a storehouse or warehouse, which, with a lodging, we hired at the small place or village where we landed. I say, the first thing was to inquire after my mother, and after my brother, that fatal person whom I married as a husband, as I have related at large. A little inquiry furnished me with information that Mrs., that is, my mother, was dead, that my brother or husband was alive, which I confess I was not very glad to hear, but which was worse. I found he was removed from the plantation where he lived formerly, and where I lived with him, and lived with one of his sons in a plantation just by the place where we landed, and where we had hired a warehouse. I was a little surprised at first, but as I ventured to satisfy myself that he could not know me, I was not only perfectly easy, but had a great mind to see him, if it was possible to so do without his seeing me. In order to do that, I found out by inquiry the plantation where he lived, and with a woman of that place, whom I got to help me, like what we call a chairwoman, I rambled about towards the place as if I had only a mind to see the country and look about me. At last I came so near that I saw the dwelling-house. I asked the woman whose plantation that was. She said it belonged to such a man, and looking out a little to our right hands, "There," says she, "is the gentleman that owns the plantation, and his father with him." "What are their Christian names?" said I. "I know not," says she, "what the old gentleman's name is, but the son's name is Humphrey, and I believe," says she, "the father's is so too." You may guess, if you can, what a confused mixture of joy and fright possessed my thoughts upon this occasion, for I immediately knew that this was nobody else but my own son, by that father she showed me, who was my own brother. I had no mask, but I ruffled my hood so about my face that I depended upon it that after above 20 years' absence, and withal not expecting anything of me in that part of the world, he would not be able to know anything of me. But I need not have used all that caution, for the old gentleman was grown dim-sighted by some distemper which had fallen upon his eyes, and could but just see well enough to walk about, and not run against a tree or into a ditch. The woman that was with me had told me that by a mere accident, knowing nothing of what importance it was to me. As they drew near to us, I said, "Does he know you, Mrs. Owen?" So they called the woman. "Yes," said she, "if he hears me speak he will know me, but he can't see well enough to know me or anybody else." And so she told me the story of his sight, as I have related. This made me secure, and so I threw open my hoods again and let them pass by me. It was a wretched thing for a mother thus to see her own son, a handsome, comely young gentleman in flourishing circumstances, and durst not make herself known to him, and durst not take any notice of him. Let any mother of children that reads this consider it, and but think with what anguish of mind I restrained myself, what yearnings of soul I had in me to embrace him and weep over him, and how I thought all my entrails turned within me, that my very bowels moved, and I knew not what to do, as I know now not how to express those agonies. When he went from me, I stood gazing and trembling and looking after him as long as I could see him. Then sitting down to rest me, but turned from her, and lying on my face, wept, and kissed the ground that he had set his foot upon. I could not conceal my disorder so much from the woman, but that she perceived it, and thought I was not well, which I was obliged to pretend was true. Upon which she pressed me to rise, the ground being damp and dangerous, which I did accordingly, and walked away. As I was going back again, and still talking of this gentleman and his son, a new occasion of melancholy offered itself thus. The woman began as if she would tell me a story to divert me. "There goes," says she, "a very odd tale among the neighbors where this gentleman formerly lived." "What was that?" said I. "Why," she says, "that old gentleman going to England when he was a young man, fell in love with a young lady there, one of the finest women that ever was seen, and married her, and brought her over hither to his mother, who was then living. He lived here several years with her," continued she, "and had several children by her, of which the young gentleman that was with him now was one. But after some time the old gentlewoman, his mother, talked to her of something relating to herself when she was in England, and of her circumstances in England, which were bad enough. The daughter-in-law began to be very much surprised and uneasy, and, in short, examining further into things, it appeared past all contradiction that the old gentlewoman was her own mother, and that consequently that son was his wife's own brother, which struck the whole family with horror, and put them into such confusion that it had almost ruined them all. The young woman would not live with him. The son, her brother, and husband, for a time went distracted, and at last the young woman went away to England, and has never been heard of since. It is easy to believe that I was strangely affected with this story, but 'tis impossible to describe the nature of my disturbance. I seemed astonished at the story, and asked her 1,000 questions about the particulars, which I found she was thoroughly acquainted with. At last I began to inquire into the circumstances of the family, how the old gentlewoman, I mean my mother, died, and how she left what she had, for my mother had promised me very solemnly that when she died she would do something for me, and leave it so as that, if I was living, I should one way or other come at it, without its being in the power of her son, my brother and husband, to prevent it. She told me she did not know exactly how it was ordered, but she had been told that my mother had left a sum of money, and had tied her plantation for the payment of it, to be made good to the daughter, if ever she could be heard of, either in England or elsewhere, and that the trust was left with this son, who was the person that we saw with his father. This was news too good for me to make light of, and you may be sure filled my heart with 1,000 thoughts what course I should take, how and when, and in what manner I should make myself known, or whether I should ever make This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gemma Blythe. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 23. Here was a perplexity that I had not indeed skill to manage myself in, neither knew I what course to take. It lay heavy upon my mind night and day. I could neither sleep nor converse, so that my husband perceived it, and wondered what ailed me, strove to divert me, but it was all to no purpose. He pressed me to tell him what it was troubled me, but I put it off, till at last, importuning me continually, I was forced to form a story which yet had a plain truth to lay it upon too. I told him I was troubled because I found we must shift our quarters and alter our scheme of settling, for that I found I should be known if I stayed in that part of the country. For that my mother being dead, several of my relations were come into that part where we then was, and that I must either discover myself to them, which in our present circumstances was not proper on many accounts, or remove, and which to do I knew not, and that this it was that made me so melancholy and so thoughtful. He joined with me in this, that it was by no means proper for me to make myself known to anybody in the circumstances in which we then were, and therefore he told me he would be willing to remove to any other part of the country, or even to another country if I thought fit. But now I had another difficulty, which was, that if I removed to any other colony, I put myself out of the way of ever making a due search after those effects which my mother had left. Again, I could never so much as think of breaking the secret of my former marriage to my new husband. It was not a story, as I thought, that would bear telling, nor could I tell what might be the consequences of it, and it was impossible to search into the bottom of the thing without making it public all over the country, as well who I was as what I now was also. In this perplexity I continued a great while, and this made my spouse very uneasy, for he found me perplexed, and yet thought I was not open with him, and did not let him into every part of my grievance. And he would often say he wondered what he had done, that I would not trust him with whatever it was, especially if it was grievous and afflicting. The truth is, he ought to have trusted with everything, for no man in the world could deserve better of a wife. But this was a thing I knew not how to open to him, and yet, having nobody to disclose any part of it to, the burden was too heavy for my mind. For let them say what they please of our sex, not being able to keep a secret, my life is a plain conviction to me of the contrary. But be it our sex or the man's sex, a secret of moment should always have a confidant, a bosom friend, to whom we may communicate the joy of it or the grief of it, be it which it will, or it will be a double weight upon the spirits, and perhaps become even insupportable in itself. And this I appeal to all human testimony for the truth of. And this is the cause why many times men as well as women, and men of the greatest and best qualities other ways, yet have found themselves weak in this part, and have not been able to bear the weight of a secret joy, or of a secret sorrow, but have been obliged to disclose it, even for the mere giving vent to themselves, and to unbend the mind oppressed with the load of weights which attended it. Nor was this any token of folly or thoughtlessness at all, but a natural consequence of the thing, and such people, had they struggled longer with the oppression, would certainly have told it in their sleep, and disclosed the secret, let it have been of what fatal nature soever, without regard to the person to whom it might be exposed. This necessity of nature is a thing which works sometimes with such vehemence in the minds of those who are guilty of any atrocious villainy, such as secret murder in particular, that they had been obliged to discover it, though the consequences would necessarily be their own destruction. Now, though it may be true that the divine justice ought to have the glory of all those discoveries and confessions, yet 'tis as certain that Providence, which ordinarily works by the hands of nature, makes use here of the same natural causes to produce those extraordinary effects. I could give several remarkable instances of this in my long conversation with crime and with criminals. I knew one fellow that, while I was in prison in Newgate, was one of those they called then night flyers. I know not what other word they may have understood it by since, but he was one who by connivance was admitted to go abroad every evening, when he played his pranks, and furnished those honest people they call thief-catchers with business to find out the next day, and restore for a reward what they had stolen the evening before. This fellow was as sure to tell in his sleep all that he had done, and every step he had taken, what he had stolen and where, as sure as if he had engaged to tell it waking, and that there was no harm or danger in it, and therefore he was obliged, after he had been out, to lock himself up, or be locked up by some of the keepers that had him in fee, that nobody should hear him. But, on the other hand, if he had told all the particulars, and given a full account of his rambles and success to any comrade, any brother thief, or to his employers, as I may justly call them, then all was well with him, and he slept as quietly as other people. As the publishing this account of my life is for the sake of the just moral of very part of it, and for instruction, caution, warning, and improvement to every reader, so this will not pass, I hope, for an unnecessary digression concerning some people being obliged to disclose the greatest secrets, either of their own or other people's affairs. Under the certain oppression of this weight upon my mind, I labored in the case I had been naming, and the only relief I found for it was to let my husband into so much of it as I thought would convince him of the necessity there was for us to think of settling in some other part of the world, and the next consideration before us was, which part of the English settlements we should go to. My husband was a perfect stranger to the country, and had not yet so much as a geographical knowledge of the situation of the several places, and I, that, till I wrote this, did not know what the word geographical signified, had only a general knowledge from long conversation with people that came from, or went to, several places. But this I knew, that Maryland, Pennsylvania, East and West Jersey, New York, and New England lay all north of Virginia, and that they were consequently all colder climates, to which, for that very reason, I had an aversion. For that as I naturally loved warm weather, so now I grew into years I had a stronger inclination to shun a cold climate. I therefore considered of going to Carolina, which is the only southern colony of the English on the continent of America, and hither I proposed to go, and the rather because I might with great ease come from thence at any time, when it might be proper to inquire after my mother's effects, and to make myself known enough to demand them. With this resolution I proposed to my husband our going away from where we was, and carrying all our effects with us to Carolina, where we resolved to settle, for my husband readily agreed to the first part, that was not at all proper to stay where we was, since I had assured him we should be known there, and the rest I effectually concealed from him. But now I found a new difficulty upon me, The main affair grew heavy upon my mind still, and I could not think of going out of the country without somehow or other making inquiry into the grand affair of what my mother had done for me. Nor could I with any patience bear the thought of going away and not make myself known to my old husband, brother, or to my child, his son. Only I would fain have had this done without my new husband having any knowledge of it, or they having any knowledge of him, or that I had such a thing as a husband. I cast about innumerable ways in my thoughts how this might be done. I would gladly have sent my husband away to Carolina with all our goods, and have come after myself. But this was impracticable. He would never stir without me, being himself perfectly unacquainted with the country, and with the methods of settling there, or anywhere else. Then I thought we would both go first with part of our goods, and then when we were settled I should come back to Virginia and fetch the remainder. But even then I knew he would never part with me and be left there to go alone. The case was plain. He was bred a gentleman, and by consequence was not only unacquainted but indolent, and when we did settle, would much rather go out into the woods with his gun, which they called there hunting, and which is the ordinary work of the Indians, and which they do as servants. I say he would rather do that than attend the natural business of his plantation. These were therefore difficulties insurmountable, and such as I knew not what to do in. I had such strong impressions on my mind about discovering myself to my brother, formerly my husband, that I could not withstand them, and the rather because it ran constantly in my thoughts that if I did not do it while he lived, I might in vain endeavor to convince my son afterward that I was really the same person, and that I was his mother, and so might both lose the assistance and comfort of the relation, and the benefit of whatever it was my mother had left me. And yet, on the other hand, I could never think it proper to discover myself to them in the circumstances I was in, as well relating to the having a husband with me as to my being brought over by a legal transportation as a criminal, on both which accounts it was absolutely necessary to me to remove from the place where I was and come again to him as from another place and in another figure. Upon these considerations I went on with telling my husband the absolute necessity there was of our not settling in Potomac River, at least that we should be presently made public there, whereas if we went to any other place in the world we should come in with as much reputation as any family that came to plant. That, as it was always agreeable to the inhabitants to have families come among them to plant, who brought substance with them, either to purchase plantations or begin new ones, so we should be sure of a kind, agreeable reception, and that without any possibility of a discovery of our circumstances. I told him in general, too, that as I had several relations in the place where we were, and that I durst not let myself be known to them, because they would soon come into a knowledge of the occasion and reason of my coming over, which would be to expose myself to the last degree. So I had reason to believe that my mother, who died here, had left me something, and perhaps considerable, which it might be very well worth my while to inquire after, and that this too could not be done without exposing us publicly, unless we went from hence, and then wherever we settled I might come, as it were, to visit and to see my brother and nephews, make myself known to them, claim and inquire after what was my due, be received with respect, and at the same time have justice done me with cheerfulness and goodwill. Whereas if I did it now, I could expect nothing but with trouble, such as exacting it by force, receiving it with curses and reluctance, and with all kinds of affronts, which he would not perhaps bear to see, that in case of being obliged to legal proofs of being really her daughter, I might be at loss, be obliged to have recourse to England, and it may be to fail at last, and so lose it, whatever it might be. With these arguments, and having thus acquainted my husband with the whole secret so far as was needful of him, we resolved to go and seek a settlement in some other colony, and at first thoughts Carolina was the place we pitched upon. In order to do this, we began to make inquiry for vessels going to Carolina, and in a very little while got information that on the other side of the bay, as they call it, namely in Maryland, there was a ship which came from Carolina, laden with rice and other goods, and was going back again thither, and from thence to Jamaica with provisions. On this news we hired a sloop to take in our goods, and taking, as it were, a final farewell of Potomac River, we went with all our cargo over to Maryland. This was a long and unpleasant voyage, and my spouse said it was worse to him than all the voyage from England, because the weather was but indifferent, the water rough, and the vessel small and inconvenient. In the next place, we were full 100 miles up Potomac River, in a part which they call Westmoreland County, and as that river is by far the greatest in Virginia, and I have heard say it is the greatest river in the world that falls into another river, and not directly into the sea. So we had base weather in it, and were frequently in great danger, for though we were in the middle, we could not see land on either side for many leagues together. Then we had the great river or Bay of Chesapeake to cross, which is where the river Potomac falls into it, near 30 miles broad, and we entered more great vast waters, whose names I know not, so that our voyage was full 200 miles in a poor sorry sloop with all our treasure, and if any accident had happened to us, we might at last have been very miserable. Supposing we had lost our goods and saved our lives only, and had then been left naked and destitute, and in a wild, strange place, not having one friend or acquaintance in all that part of the world, the very thought of it gives me some horror, even since the danger is past. Well, we came to the place in 5 days' sailing. I think they called it Philip's Point, and behold, when we came thither, the ship bound to Carolina was loaded and gone away but 3 days before. This was a disappointment. But, however, I, that was to be discouraged with nothing, told my husband that since we could not get passage to Carolina, and that the country we was in was very fertile and good, we would, if he liked of it, see if we could find out anything for our tune where we was, and that if he liked things, we would settle here. We immediately went on shore, but found no conveniences just at that place, either for our being on shore or preserving our goods on shore, but was directed by a very honest Quaker whom we found there, to go to a place about 60 miles east, that is to say, nearer the mouth of the bay, where he said he lived, and where we should be accommodated, either to plant or to wait for any other place to plant, and that might be more convenient. And he invited us with so much kindness and simple honesty that we agreed to go, and the Quaker himself went with us. Here we bought us 2 servants, an English woman servant, just come on shore from a ship of Liverpool, and a Negro man-servant, things absolutely necessary for all people that pretended to settle in that country. This honest Quaker was very helpful to us. and when we came to the place that he proposed to us, found us out a convenient storehouse for our goods, and lodging for ourselves and our servants, and about 2 months or thereabouts afterwards, by his direction, we took up a large piece of land from the governor of that country in order to form our plantation. And so we laid the thoughts of going to Carolina wholly aside, having been very well received here, and accommodated with a convenient lodging till we could prepare things, and have land enough cleared, and timber and materials provided for building us a house, all which we managed by the direction of the Quaker, so that in 1 year's time we had nearly 50 acres of land clear, part of it enclosed, and some of it planted with tobacco, though not much. Besides, we had garden ground and corn sufficient to help supply our servants with roots and herbs and bread. And now I persuaded my husband to let me go over the bay again and inquire after my friends. He was willing to consent to it now, because he had business upon his hands sufficient to employ him, besides his gun to divert him, which they call hunting there, and which he greatly delighted in. And indeed we used to look at one another sometimes with a great deal of pleasure, reflecting how much better that was, not than Newgate only, but than the most prosperous of our circumstances in the wicked trade that we had been both carrying on. Our affair was in a very good posture. We purchased of the proprietors of the colony as much land for £35, paid in ready money, as would make a sufficient plantation to employ between 50 and 60 servants, and which, being well improved, would be sufficient to us as long as we could either of us live. And as for children, I was past the prospect of anything of that kind. But our good fortune did not end here. I went, as I have said, over the bay, to the place where my brother, once my husband, lived. But I did not go to the same village where I was before, but went up another great river, on the east side of the river Potomac, called Rappahannock River, and by this means came on the back of his plantation, which was large, and by the help of a navigable creek, or little river, that ran into the Rappahannock, I came very near it. I was now fully resolved to go up point blank to my brother, husband, and tell him who I was, but not knowing what temper I might find him in, or how much out of temper, rather, I might make him by such a rash visit, I resolved to write a letter to him first, to let him know who I was, and that I was come not to give him any trouble upon the old relation, which I hoped was entirely forgot, but that I applied to him as a sister to a brother, desiring his assistance in the case of that provision which our mother, at her decease, had left for my support, and which I did not doubt but he would do me justice in, especially considering that I was come thus far to look after it. I said some very tender, kind things in the letter about his son, which I told him he knew to be my own child, and that as I was guilty of nothing in marrying him, any more than he was in marrying me, neither of us having then known our being at all related to one another, so I hoped he would allow me the most passionate desire of once seeing my one and only child, and of showing something of the infirmities of a mother in preserving a violent affection for him, who had never been able to retain any thought of me, one way or other. I did believe that, having received this letter, he would immediately give it to his son to read, I having understood his eyes being so dim that he could not see to read it, and it fell out better than so, for as his sight was dim, so he had allowed his son to open all letters that came to his hand for him, and the old gentleman being from home, or out of the way when the messenger came, My letter came directly to my son's hand, and he opened and read it. He called the messenger in after some little stay, and asked him where the person who gave him the letter was. The messenger told him the place, which was about 7 miles off. So he bid him stay, and ordering a horse to be got ready, and 2 servants, away he came to me with the messenger. Let anyone judge the consternation I was in when my messenger came back, and told me the old gentleman was not at home, but his son was come along with him, and was just coming up to me. I was perfectly confounded, for I knew not whether it was peace or war, nor could I tell how to behave. However, I had but a very few moments to think, for my son was at the heels of the messenger, and coming up into my lodgings, asked the fellow at the door something. I suppose it was, for I did not hear it so as to understand it, which was the gentlewoman that sent him. For the messenger said, "There she is, sir," at which he comes directly up to me, kisses me, took me in his arms, and embraced me with so much passion that he could not speak. But I could feel his breast heave and throb, like a child that cries, but sobs and cannot cry out. I can neither express nor describe the joy that touched my very soul when I found, for it was easy to discover that part, that he came not as a stranger, but as a son to a mother, and indeed as a son who had never before known what a mother of his own was. In short, we cried over one another a considerable while, when at last he broke out first. "My dear mother," says he, "are you still alive? I never expected to have seen your face." As for me, I could say nothing a great while. After we had both recovered ourselves a little, and were able to talk, he told me how things stood. As to what I had written to his father, he told me he had not showed my letter to his father, or told him anything about it; that what his grandmother left me was in his hands, and that he would do me justice to my full satisfaction; that as to his father, he was old and infirm, both in body and mind; that he was very fretful and passionate, almost blind, and capable of nothing; and he questioned whether he would know how to act in an affair which was of so nice a nature as this, and that therefore he had come himself, as well as to satisfy himself in seeing me, which he could not restrain himself from, as also it put into my power to make a judgment, after I had seen how things were, whether I would discover myself to his father or no. This was really so prudently and wisely managed that I found my son was a man of sense and needed no direction from me. I told him I did not wonder that his father was as he had described him, for that his head was a little touched before I went away, and principally his disturbance was because I could not be persuaded to conceal our relation and to live with him as my husband, after I knew that he was my brother; that as he knew better than I what his father's present condition was, I should readily join with him in such measure as he would direct; that I was indifferent as to seeing his father, since I had seen him first, and he could not have told me better news than to tell me that what his grandmother had left me was entrusted in his hands, who, I doubted not, now he knew who I was, would, as he said, do me justice. I inquired then how long my mother had been dead, and where she died, and told so many particulars of the family that I left him no room to doubt the truth of my being really and truly his mother. My son then inquired where I was and how I had disposed myself. I told him I was on the Maryland side of the bay, at the plantation of a particular friend who came from England in the same ship with me. That as for that side of the bay where he was, I had no habitation. He told me I should go home with him and live with him if I pleased, as long as I lived, that as to his father he knew nobody and would never so much as guess at me. I considered of that a little, and told him that though it was really no concern to me to live at a distance from him, yet I could not say it would be the most comfortable thing in the world to me to live in a house with him, and to have that unhappy object always before me, which had been such a blow to my peace before, that though I should be glad to have his company, my son, or to be as near him as possible while I stayed, yet I could not think of being in the house where I should be also under constant restraint for fear of betraying myself in my discourse, nor should I be able to refrain some expressions in my conversing with him as my son that might discover the whole affair, which would by no means be convenient. He acknowledged that I was right in all this. "But then, dear mother," says he, "you shall be as near me as you can." So he took me with him on horseback to a plantation next to his own, and where I was as well entertained as I could have been in his own. Having left me there, he went away home, telling me we would talk of the main business the next day, and having first called me his aunt, and given a charge to the people, who it seems were his tenants, to treat me with all possible respect. About 2 hours after he was gone, he sent me a maidservant and a negro boy to wait on me, and provisions ready dressed for my supper. And thus I was as if I had been in a new world, and began secretly now to wish that I had not brought my Lancashire husband. However, that wish was not hearty neither, for I loved my Lancashire husband entirely, as indeed I had ever done from the beginning, and he merited from me as much as it was possible for a man to do. But that by the way. The next morning my son came to visit me again, almost as soon as I was up. After a little discourse, he first of all pulled out a deerskin bag and gave it to me, with 55 Spanish pistoles in it, and told me that it was to supply my expenses from England, for though it was not his business to inquire, yet he ought to think I did not bring a great deal of money out with me, it is not being usual to bring much money into that country. Then he pulled out his grandmother's will and read it over to me, whereby it appeared that she had left a small plantation, as he called it, on York River, that is, where my mother lived, to me, with the stock of servants and cattle upon it, and given it in trust to this son of mine for my use, whenever he should hear of my being alive, and to my heirs, if I had any children, and in default of heirs, to whomsoever I should by will dispose of it, but gave the income of it, till I should be heard of or found, to my said son, and if I should not be living, then it was to him and his heirs. This plantation, though remote from him, he said he did not let out, but managed it by a head clerk, Stewart, as he did another that was his father's, that lay hard by it, and went over himself 3 or 4 times a year to look after it. I asked him what he thought the plantation might be worth. He said if I would let it out, he would give me about £60 a year for it, but if I would live on it, Then it would be worth much more, and he believed would bring me in about £150 a year. By seeing I was likely either to settle on the other side of the bay, or might perhaps have a mind to go back to England again, if I would let him be my steward, he would manage it for me, as he had done for himself, and that he believed he should be able to send me as much tobacco to England from it as would yield me about £100 a year, sometimes more. This was all strange news to me, and things I had not been used to, and really my heart began to look up more seriously than I think it ever did before, and to look with great thankfulness to the hand of Providence, which had done such wonders for me, who had been myself the greatest wonder of wickedness, perhaps, that had been suffered to live in the world. And I must again observe that not on this occasion only, but even on all other occasions of thankfulness, my past wicked and abominable life never looked so monstrous to me, and I never so completely abhorred it and reproached myself with it, as when I had a sense upon me of Providence doing good to me, while I had been making those vile returns on my part. But I leave the reader to improve these thoughts, as no doubt they will see cause, and I go on to the fact. My son's tender carriage and kind offers fetched tears from me, almost all the while he talked with me. Indeed, I could scarce discourse with him, but in the intervals of my passion. However, at length I began, and expressing myself with wonder at my being so happy to have the trust of what I had left put into the hands of my own child, I told him that as to the inheritance of it, I had no child but him in the world, and was now past having any if I should marry, and therefore would desire him to get a writing drawn, which I was ready to execute, by which I would, after me, give it wholly to him and his heirs. And in the meantime, smiling, I asked him what made him continue a bachelor so long. His answer was kind and ready, that Virginia did not yield any great plenty of wives, and that since I talked of going back to England, I should send him a wife from London. This was the substance of our first day's conversation, the pleasantest day that ever passed over my head in my life, and which gave me the truest satisfaction. He came every day after this, and spent a great part of his time with me, and carried me about to several of his friends' houses, where I was entertained with great respect. Also, I dined several times at his own house, when he took care always to see his half-dead father so out of the way that I never saw him, or he me. I made him one present, and it was all I had of value, and that was one of the gold watches, of which I mentioned above, that I had 2 in my chest, and this I happened to have with me, and I gave it him at his 3rd visit. I told him I had nothing of any value to bestow but that, and I desired he would now and then kiss it for my sake. I did not indeed tell him that I had stole it from a gentlewoman's side at a meeting-house in London, that's by the way. He stood a little while, hesitating, as if doubtful whether to take it or not, but I pressed it on him, and made him accept it, and it was not much less worth than his leather pouch full of Spanish gold. No, though it were to be reckoned as if at London, whereas it was worth twice as much there, where I gave it him. At length he took it, kissed it, told me the watch should be a debt upon him that he would be paying as long as I lived. A few days after, he brought the writings of gift, and the scrivener with them, and I signed them very freely, and delivered them to him with 100 kisses. For sure nothing ever passed between a mother and a tender, dutiful child with more affection The next day he brings me an obligation under his hand and seal, whereby he engaged himself to manage and improve the plantation for my account, and with his utmost skill, and to remit the produce to my order wherever I should be, and withal to be obliged himself to make up the produce 100 pounds a year to me. When he had done so, he told me that as I came to demand it before the crop was off, I had a right to produce of the current year, and so he paid me 100 pounds in Spanish pieces of 8, and desired me to give him a receipt for it, as in full for that year, ending at Christmas following, this being about the latter end of August. I stayed here about 5 weeks, and indeed had much ado to get away then. Nay, he would have come over the bay with me, but I would by no means allow him to it. However, he would send me over in a sloop of his own, which he built like a yacht, and served him as well for pleasure as business. This I accepted of, and so, after the utmost expressions both of duty and affection, he let me come away, and I arrived safe in 2 days at my friends the Quakers. I brought over with me for the use of our plantation 3 horses with harness and saddles, some hogs, 2 cows, and 1,000 other things, the gift of the kindest and tenderest child that ever a woman had. I related to my husband all the particulars of this voyage, except that I called my son my cousin. And first I told him that I had lost my watch, which he seemed to take as a misfortune. But then I told him how kind my cousin had been, that my mother had left me such a plantation, and that he had preserved it for me, in hopes some time or other he should hear from me. Then I told him that I had left it to his management, that he would render me a faithful account of its produce, and then I pulled him out the 100 pounds in silver as the first year's produce, and then pulling out the deerskin purse with the pistols, "And here, my dear," says I, "is the gold watch. My husband, so is heaven's goodness sure to work the same effects in all sensible minds, where mercies touch the heart," lifted up both hands, and with an ecstasy of joy, "What is God a-doing," says he, "for such an ungrateful dog as I am?" Then I let him know what I had brought over in the sloop, besides all this. I mean the horses, hogs, and cows, and other stores for our plantation, all which added to his surprise and filled his heart with thankfulness. And from this time forward I believe he was as sincere a penitent and as thoroughly a reformed man as ever God's goodness brought back from a profligate, a highwayman, and a robber. I could fill a larger history than this with the evidence of this truth, and but that I doubt that part of the story will not be equally diverting as the wicked part, I have had thoughts of making a volume of it by itself. As for myself, as this is to be my own story, not my husband's, I return to that part which related to myself. We went on with our plantation, and managed it with the help and diversion of such friends as we got there by our obliging behavior, and especially the honest Quaker, who proved a faithful, generous, and steady friend to us. And we had very good success, for having a flourishing stock to begin with, as I have said, and this being now increased by the addition of 150 pounds sterling in money, we enlarged our number of servants, built us a very good house, and cured every year a great deal of land. The second year I wrote to my old governess, giving her part with us of the joy of our success, and order her how to lay out the money I had left with her, which was 250 pounds as above, and to send it to us in goods, which she performed with her usual kindness and fidelity, and this arrived safe for us. Here we had a supply of all sorts of clothes, as well as my husband as for myself, and I took especial care to buy for him all those things that I knew he delighted to have, as 2 good long wigs, 2 silver-hilted swords, 3 or 4 fine fowling pieces, a fine saddle with holsters and pistols very handsome, with a scarlet cloak, and, in a word, everything I could think of to oblige him and to make him appear as he really was, a very fine gentleman. I ordered a good quantity of such household stuff as we yet wanted, with linen of all sorts for us both. As for myself, I wanted very little of clothes or linen, being very well furnished before. The rest of my cargo consisted of ironwork of all sorts, harness for horses, tools, clothes for servants, and woolen cloth, stuffs, serges, stockings, shoes, hats, and the like, such as servants wear, and whole pieces also to make up for servants, all by direction of the Quaker. And all this cargo arrived safe and in good condition, with 3 women servants, lusty wenches, which my old governess had picked for me, suitable enough to the place and to the work we had for them to do, one of which happened to come double, having been got with child by one of the seamen in the ship, as she owned afterwards, before the ship got so far as Gravesend. So she brought us a stout boy, about 7 months after her landing. My husband, you may suppose, was a little surprised at the arriving of all this cargo from England, and talking with me after he saw the account of this particular. "My dear," says he, "what is the meaning of all this? I fear you will run us too deep in debt. When shall we be able to make return for it all?" I smiled, and told him that it was all paid for, and then I told him that what our circumstances might expose us to, I had not taken my whole stock with me, that I had reserved so much in my friend's hands, which now we were come over safe, and was settled in a way to live I had sent for, as he might see. He was amazed, and stood a while telling upon his fingers, but said nothing. At last he began thus: "Hold, let's see," says he, telling upon his fingers still, and first on his thumb. "There's 246 pounds in money at first, then 2 gold watches, diamond rings, and plate," says he, upon the forefinger. Then upon the next finger: "Here's a plantation on York River, 100 pounds a year, then 150 pounds in money, then a sloop load of horses, cows, hogs, and stores," and so on to the thumb again. "And now," says he, "a cargo cost 250 pounds in England, and worth here twice the money." "Well," says I, "what do you make of all that?" "Make of it?" says he. "Why, who says I was deceived when I married a wife in Lancashire? I think I have married a fortune, and a very good fortune too," says he. In a word, we were now in very considerable circumstances, and every year increasing, for our new plantation grew upon our hands insensibly, and in 8 years, which we lived upon it, we brought it to such a pitch that the produce was at least 300 pounds sterling a year. I mean worth so much in England. After I had been a year at home again, I went over the bay to see my son, and to receive another year's income on my plantation. And I was surprised to hear, just at my landing there, that my old husband was dead, and had not been buried above a fortnight. This, I confess, was not disagreeable news, because now I could appear as I was, in a married condition. So I told my son, before I came from him, that I believed I should marry a gentleman who had a plantation near mine, and though I was legally free to marry, as to any obligation that was on me before, yet that I was shy of it, lest the blot should some time or other be revived, and it might make my husband uneasy. My son, the same kind, dutiful, and obliging creature as ever, treated me now at his own house, paid me my 100 pounds, and sent me home again loaded with presents. Some time after this I let my son know I was married, and invited him over to see us, and my husband wrote a very obliging letter to him also, inviting him to come and see him, and he came accordingly some months after, and happened to be there just when my cargo from England came in, which I let him believe belonged all to my husband's estate, not to me. It must be observed that when the old wretch, my brother, husband, was dead, I then freely gave my husband an account of all that affair, and of this cousin, as I had called him before, being my own son by that mistaken unhappy match. He was perfectly easy in the account, and told me he should have been as easy if the old man, as we called him, had been alive. "For," said he, "it was no fault of yours, nor of his. It was a mistake impossible to be prevented. He only reproached him with desiring me to conceal it, and to live with him as a wife, after I knew that he was my brother. That, he said, was a vile part." Thus all these difficulties were made easy, and we lived together with the greatest kindness and comfort imaginable. We are grown old. I am come back to England, being almost 70 years of age, husband 68, having performed much more than the limited terms of my transportation, and now, notwithstanding all the fatigues and all the miseries we have both gone through, we are both of us in good heart and health. My husband remained there some time after me to settle our affairs, and at first I had intended to go back to him, but at his desire I altered that resolution, and he has come over to England also, where we resolve to spend the remainder of our years in sincere penitence for the wicked lives we have lived. Written in the year 1683.